Hello friends. Welcome to the Marvel Fiction Studio. How are you all? So in this video, we will see what if Batman needed support from the dynamic duo to recover. But before we start, if you want more amazing stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Also, if possible, share this video. The end. Now we will see you in the next video. Summer had yet to start, but the weather was already miserably humid and warm. I sat perched atop Wayne Tower, surveying the city with binoculars. The night had been relatively quiet, with nothing more than a few dozen felonies aborted and avoided. Perhaps tonight would be an early night, and perhaps I would actually make it to Selina's for our late dinner. Perhaps. Our relationship had taken a sudden turn in the road nearly 7 months earlier. After years of taunting and chasing one another, it had finally erupted into something more than a game of chase. Selina had been there from the beginning and would most likely be there at my end. I had been looking at our time together recently and questioning if I had wanted more. I scowled at myself. No, I had been wondering if I deserved more. My life had never been one of joy and happiness. Even as a child, I had been more serious than my peers. And after the death of my parents, reality had become far too overwhelming. I had sacrificed everything to become the Batman. Friends, family, trust, love. Breaker 19, radio check. This is Roger Dodger looking for smiles or frowns upside down, over. Nightwing, I replied hoarsely. Even at his age, he still enjoyed playing with the comm link. He had made the trip to Gotham at whim, visiting with Alfred, Tim and myself before joining in on patrols. A surprise, but certainly not an unwelcome one. Well, I'm heading home. I still have to wrap things up in the Haven before I can wrap myself up in a down comforter. It's quiet here. Need any help? I asked, the only sign of appreciation I would offer him. Nah, she's been behaving herself lately, for once. Behave yourself, over and out. I suppressed a small smile of pride as I cut the transmission. Had been the closest thing I had ever had to a son, perhaps more so than Jason and most recently Tim. As much as I had been a clueless father figure when he was younger, every time I thought of him as a grown, functional, somewhat sane part of society. Well, it made me feel a bit better. After checking the time to be a little after 2, I decided to return to the mobile to continue patrols with the company of climate control. Between the 4 of us, every borough had been visited, a feat that had been impossible when I had first started MYWAR on crime. Perhaps Gotham could be without her savior for an hour or two. As I moved to enter the mobile, I thought of the small velvet box that sat in the bottom of a trunk in the rear of my walk-in closet. It was in a yellow gift bag hidden amongst the extra clothing within. The box contained something that I had spent nearly $150,000 on 3 weeks earlier. After weeks of tormenting thoughts, I had decided to buy the ring, just in case the opportune moment presented itself. Of course, no rational thought had been used in the plan, just pure desire and hope. A leap of faith. My internal drive had urged me into the jewelry store, to select the diamond ring set in the gold band and hand over my credit card with a smile. The cashier had smiled as well, saying something about one special lady. That she was. And there it sat, in my closet, buried beneath socks. Although paranoid, I had hopes that Alfred wouldn't come across it before Saturday, despite the fact that he already had suspicions. Suspicions that were only fueled when I had told him that we would be dining at the manor instead of in town. Since we had resumed courting one another, Alfred had been beyond supportive, no doubt just as grateful that she had returned to my life. He had once told me that she was godsend, as she was the first woman to make me appreciate life. Not only others, but my own as well. Although I sacrificed my life for Batman, I had begun to wonder what I would to have Selina at my side. Normal thoughts of having her as my wife and someday the mother of my child seemed alien to me. What would it be like to wake every single morning to see her face, peaceful with sleep? Although it was anyone's rightful with to be happy, I still found myself wondering if I too bore that right. What would I surrender for that right, for her? We had casually discussed the future less than a handful of times. Although no simple question, let alone a simple one to answer, she had inquired as to how long I saw myself protecting Gotham. The only reply I was able to give her was that I would stop when I was no longer able to do what was necessary. When she asked what that was, I had simply told her that I had no idea. She had nodded, kissed me and then said, "Fair enough." End of discussion. But her question had brought up a valid point. One I had never truly considered in my tie and the cowl. What would make me quit? Paralysis hadn't stopped me. The death of my colleagues and even protégés hadn't either. Of all the obstacles I had ever faced, nothing had ever forced me to consciously consider ending it all for good. Taking the driver's seat, I hit the ignition, sitting motionless as I stared at the empty street before me. Selina had asked me a simple question as we shared a bottle of wine on her couch at 3 a.m, and somehow I was debating my future. She had taken me back into her life when she had no reason to ever talk to me again. I had bought a ring for her despite never having any intention of proposing to her. Shifting into gear, the mobile began to creep forward as my mind tried to regain focus. Oracle's face appeared on the center console's LCD. "You don't have anything on your plate, do you?" Thankful for the distraction, I curtly replied, "No. GCPD is moving into the French Quarter. Looks like a tip came through and Pasquale's out to buy it tonight. SWAT and state police are moving into place as we speak. Dad's at his office still, but he'll be on his way down soon. I'll drop by there first." "All right. Want Robin? He's over on Exeter with Batgirl." "No, have them head out to the quarter. Backup only." "Got it, boss," she nodded before the image went black. With a sigh, I turned off into an alley and headed back towards Tri-Corner. After I turned onto 67th Avenue, I gunned the engine to make haste to police headquarters. So much for dinner, Selina. Perhaps, later, after Pasquale was in lockup along with his drug-running goons. Perhaps then we could sit together and talk about what we would do with our lives. About how she would redecorate my bedroom and then how Alfred would have to stop picking out my clothes. How we could set up a nursery in the next room, maybe. And how we'll live happily ever after. Perhaps. Parking in a dark alleyway, I activated the security system before shooting a grappling hook up to the top of the ancient building. I landed soundlessly a familiar window ledge, silently opening it before entering the dark room. As expected, Gordon sat hunched over his desk, taking a moment to himself before descending into hell. With no time to waste, I cleared my throat, announcing my presence. Gordon jumped, as usual, and cursed me under his breath. It was as he piled documents together on his desk that I noticed the smoldering ashtray near his left hand. He followed my gaze. "Oh, don't you even think of lecturing me. I am stressed to the gills. Nicotine's my only prayer." He smiled as he stood and leaned against his desk. "Nicotine and you, that is." Deciding to move on to business, I asked hoarsely, "How many men?" He sighed and removed his glasses. 13, give or take. Surveillance counted 4 cars that pulled into the rear parking garage, but the tinted windows didn't give them a chance to count heads. But we have the troops armed and ready. Shoot to kill? With him, we have no other choice. Henri Pasquale had been plaguing the eastern seaboard with imported European drugs for more than a decade under a number of aliases. He had recently made his way into the Gotham underbelly and we had been doing our best to welcome him with open arms and shackles. Gordon growled, "God knows how many 18-year-olds are going to get it tonight. Too many. Always too many." He stood abruptly and walked over to the coat rack near the door. Upon donning his holster and trench coat, he continued, "I'll see you there." As I paused at the window, I spoke quietly, "Careful, Jim." And before I could leave, he said, "You, too, friend." Our affiliation had been a long and rocky one. So much had come between us, from the law, broken promises as well as his family and mine. Although we had spent the last few years in an amiable alliance, I would always be haunted by the anger I had seen in his eyes from the night Two-Face had nearly beaten to death. The fear in his eyes as he had accused me of endangering his life and how he would come after me if the boy had died. I had told him to trust me, and he had. The 15-minute ride to the other side of town took 8 in the mobile, courtesy running 7 red lights. Once I had found a concealed parking spot, I quickly spotted Batgirl and Robin perched on the roof of the building facing the barricaded restaurant. With their binoculars out, they were fast to spot me as well. I nodded at them and they signaled that everything was set. I looked up at the neon sign, with pink Roman script, La Belle Fleur, glowing in the dark. The building itself was a 3-story brick and glass creation that had once been a hotspot for Gotham's elite. With my night lenses, I could only spot a few lookouts, armed with Uzis. One false move. That's all it took. Pasquale's gun-bearing men had apparently grown tired of watching the police assemble outside and had taken the offense, opening fire at will. My only other encounter with Pasquale's army had been a week earlier, composed mainly of ex-cons and tween boys with wild eyes and thin faces. They tried desperately to empty their rounds into the officers, although I only heard reports of 3 wounded over the scanners. After a 15 minutes of flying bullet, I decided not to bear witness to any more senseless bloodshed. Without making contact with Gordon, I moved in close to the rear of the building, strategically throwing in my own brand of tear gas capsules. Thick hazy smoke seeped from the windows and soon, grown men poured out of the exits screaming in pain, bent at the waist with crippling nausea. Crime did not pay. "We'll cover you," Robin's voice found my ear. I turned to see him standing tall, a determined look on his face. Batgirl stood next to him, her head high and fists clenched. "Tim and Cassandra. And Barbara, no, stay here. Help maintain the ones that have come out. They still need to be dealt with." He nodded before they made their way around to the front, seemingly racing one another to get to a thug first. As I finally breached the rear entrance, I donned my gas mask, a vent though I had developed a near-perfect immunity to it and would not suffer its full effects. The ground floor of the restaurant was filled with scattered tables, chairs and pieces of broken window. Gordon had said there had been at least 15 men that had arrived and 14 had been spotted exiting the building. Gordon had been 2 off. I spotted Pasquale 10 yards away, holding a cloth to his face. 2 other men were with him with the large bulk and defining presence of bodyguards. After watching them move around in the darkness for a moment, I leapt at the trio and brought my elbows down into the juncture of their necks and shoulders of the bigger men. Both fell instantly and found they could not move their arms. Nerve blocks. IT took several, fast-paced blows to their head and necks, but I was able to render them both unconscious. In that fraction of a minute, Pasquale escaped my sight as he blindly maneuvered into the kitchen. After throwing the 2 men out the front window, I went after him, seeing him clearly through starlight lenses. He had Smith & Wesson in one hand and 6-inch switchblade in the other. In the dark, they were useless tools, for sight was required to use them. But in my case, darkness was the most useful tool, a tool, acting as a means of offense and defense. I watched him as he walked about the dark room, softly calling out the names of his missing comrades as he kept bumping into counters and cold stovetops. His breath grew heavier as he realized he was alone. The small goatee on his chin quivered as his lips began to tremble in fear. Given that I had the time, I considered several options to bring him down, all of which would likely involve him being in at least 2 different casts for the next few months. I settled for disarming him with a swift kick to the elbow, followed by a series of jabs, crosses and elbow hits to the face, neck and chest, and a final twist to his wrist. The end result was the gun falling to the floor and the knife flinging across the room as he screamed in pain. After a hard blow to the base of the skull, he crumpled to the floor. I growled, dragged him by the foot to the front of the restaurant and threw him out the window where he landed on his bodyguards. At least they protected him from getting road rash. Taking a moment, I watched from the window as officers tackled them, began reading Miranda rights and securing them. Robin and Batgirl had done their fair share of work, with the remaining thugs ing and limping into holding vans. They had taken to standing beside Gordon and Bullock, not 30 feet away. After offering a curt nod, I returned my focus to Pasquale, horrified to see that he had not only regained consciousness but that he had staggered to his feet, nose dripping blood over an eerie smile. He had managed to stab one of the officers in the face with a shard of broken glass, giving him just enough time to rip the gun from the tactical unit member's hands. Time slowed as he extended his arms and aimed for the commissioner. Although there were already officers tackling Pasquale, I knew he would be able to get enough shots off to get the job done. I leapt from the window and landed mere feet in front of the wide-eyed Pasquale. 3 shots fired in rapid succession and I felt each one slam into my body armor. Time continued to crawl as I fell to the ground, my eyes catching on a green glove as it reached out for me. Odd, the sirens had faded, the shouts, the gunfire, nothing. Faces appeared around me suddenly. Robin, Bullock, Jim. Gordon's hand wrapped around mine and somehow I managed to nod. It was starting to throb, but at least the Kevlar held. I'm sure it would have been bad had the bullets gone through. I would be bruised and sore, no doubt. Selina would come up to the manor later, worried but hiding it with a smile and a tease. We would still have a good talk about our future, maybe in the morning, though, I thought as a bitter taste rose in the back of my throat. Faces began to blur to darkness. Didn't feel like blacking out, felt like I was floating. Sleep, That was what I needed. I would rest up for a day, then I would be ready for Saturday, even if it was just dinner, no major breakthroughs in either of our lives. As I closed my eyes, I pictured Selena teasing me. I imagined she was with me now. Her voice was light with affection. Way to go, bullseye. Funny, Fleabag. I would tell her. She would take me home, so I could sleep and get better for dinner. And then maybe I would settle down a bit. Daylight was less than 2 hours away as I stumbled through the bedroom window of my apartment. With my eyes half closed, my hands obediently removed my mask and tugged at my gloves, letting them fall victim to gravity as they fell to the carpet. My sore, fatigued legs slowly led me in the general direction of the bed, pausing to kick off boots. Yawning, I removed the black and blue tunic that stank of sweat and gunpowder. After fumbling at the body armor's hooks and snaps, I let the vest and shoulder pads drop before then undoing the utility belt that was in desperate need of a refill. At the sight of the comforter and feather pillows, I collapsed onto the bed, not even bothering with my leggings. Although it had been my day off, I had barely found more than 10 consecutive minutes to just sit and relax. I had been relatively awake by 10 in the morning, ended up going for a run before the May mugginess surfaced, followed by desperate attempt at cleaning my apartment before heading to Gotham. From there it had been a long day of catching up with Alfred, sparring with my favorite little bro, and then an awkward family dinner. That and a night of Gotham patrols followed by an early morning touring Bloodhaven. Although it would have been nice to take Bruce up on his offer to help, I had declined. It was one thing for me to return to my roots, but it was an entirely different matter for him to spread his reach to the Haven. Just as it was his city, this was mine. Sleep came almost instantly, with soft snores escaping my lips. I had a shift from 8 until 6 and was already dreading the amount of coffee it was going to take to survive it. Even after mastering power naps and mini comas, I still found myself craving for the full night's sleep that everyone else endured. Then the phone rang. "Can't a guy get a break around here?" I growled as my hand fumbled for the offensive device. On the 5th ring I muttered a weak, "Hello?" A young man's voice asked. Had I been conscious, I would have recognized the fear in his voice. "Tim. It's 5 in the morning, sorry, I need your help. Nightwing and his counterpart are unavailable right now. Please call back at a later time. Thank you." "He's hurt. Who's hurt?" I asked, slowly sitting up. "Bruce. Alfred's in with Leslie now, they're still operating." Tim's voice softened with emotion. My heart started to pump faster with concern. "Slow down, now. What happened?" Tim took a deep breath. "We were helping the police. Drug raid in the French Quarter. Gordon was in the line of fire. Pasquale took a semi-automatic from a SWAT member. Armor piercing, he dove in front of the shooter. Thought he was dead." Sniffles began to interrupt Tim's words. "He was hit 3 times. Barely alive when we brought him here." It took a moment for his words settle. I then thought to myself that Bruce had been shot dozens of times, not a new occurrence. He danced with death more times than I cared to remember, but for Tim. "What's his condition?" Tim remained silent. "Tim, where was he shot?" "It was bad, point blank." He paused, "once in the abdomen, in the chest and in the head." "The bullet grazed his head?" "No, it went inside." My heart leapt into my throat. "Tim. I'll be there in 30 minutes, okay? Sit tight." "We're at Leslie's." "Okay, I'm on my way." I threw on clothes quickly as my concern was consumed with straight-out fear. The pieces of my Nightwing suit that were strewn about the floor were still warm to the touch as I donned them once more. As I raced out the window, my pulse was throbbing in my temples. This was a fear we had never faced before. A bullet to the head meant serious business. I had known people to survive such injuries, but recovery had been far from complete. Would he ever wake up? Would he ever be normal again? Would he die? Opting for the motorcycle, I maneuvered the empty streets of Bloodhaven onto the highway. I put her in top gear, going over 125 miles per hour with nothing on my mind but the future of the man I considered to be my father. Once I had entered the city limits of Gotham, I slowed to a manageable 73 and took the 3rd exit off of the main drag. 10 minutes later, I pulled up to the rear entrance of Leslie's clinic, where I had visited more times than I have cared for. Either unconscious in the arms of Batman, or even worse, trying to carry his bleeding form to Leslie's aid. After locking up, I raced through the door and towards the surgery bay of the clinic. Given the early hour, the halls were deathly silent. Too silent. In the waiting area, Robin sat motionless next to Batgirl, her head low with defeat. Across from them sat Jim Gordon and his daughter, Barbara, both red-eyed and agitated. They looked up at me and, if possible, their faces grew more solemn. Gordon looked puzzled momentarily, then the recognition sank in, and he nodded before getting to his feet. Just then, a rough voice announced, "No more coffee, Comish, but there was some Coke in the fridge." I turned to see the disgruntled form of Detective Harvey Bullock, carrying a six-pack of cola. His hair was in disarray and his trousers and striped shirt were blood-stained. I searched for any sign of injury, and upon finding none, I concluded it had been someone else's blood. Behind him was the slim figure of Renee Montoya, her face painfully sad. She had been one of the few closely trusted police officers of the Batman. Completely opposite of her partner, they worked together flawlessly in the fight for justice. "Who the hell are you? Smokey or the Bandit?" Bullock snapped and grabbed my coat collar as he pulled my face to a mere inch from his. His breath was foul with cigar smoke and his eyes were dark with anger. "Easy, Bullock," Gordon said as he stood. "He's friend, not foe." He glanced at the commissioner before locking his eyes back onto mine. "You that freak from the Haven?" Silently, I nodded in return. I had never been one of fond feelings for Bullock, and certainly wasn't at the moment. His disorder and temper, however, made him the cop that he was. Bullock stared at me for a few seconds more and then released my jacket. He grunted something that might have been an apology before sitting down next to the commissioner. Montoya remained standing next to the wall as silence filled the waiting room. I was about to ask what the progress had been when I spotted motion out of the corner of my eye. The others looked with me towards the surgical bay at the site through the glass doors. Leslie and Alfred were dressed in surgical gowns and masks. Both had a large amount of blood splattered all over them. Leslie removed her mask and spoke with Alfred briefly, and he nodded, turned and directed several nurses that had helped the surgery. As Leslie opened the doors in order to approach us, we caught a glimpse of a stretcher being pushed down the hall. The being that rested on it was wrapped in gauze and had tubes running over him from every direction. Leslie removed her soiled apparel and put them in a hamper as she proceeded towards the group, radiographs in her left hand. Her face was solemn, but then again, whenever we were injured, no matter how slight, she was reminded of the cost of Bruce's war. I feared what price Bruce was about to pay. Carrot v. Carrot. The group stood in unison as Leslie stopped in front of us. "Don't stand up for me. It's been a long night and it's not over yet." I sat back down next to Batgirl, even though I wanted nothing more than to race through the doors and down the hall into recovery. I had to see him, I had to feel his pulse. After Pasquale had been taken down, for the second and final time, I had wasted no time in running to Batman's side. At first, I had thought that he had been able to take the hits to the chest, and that even with armor-piercing rounds he wouldn't have been in too bad of shape. Far better than the commissioner would have fared. It was I reached out for him that I had realized I had been far too optimistic. We had applied compresses from our first aid kits in the belts, then moving on to staunching blood with material ripped from Harvey Bullock's own trench coat. For the first few minutes, he had seemed alert, looking to each of our faces, even nodding at Jim when he had grasped his gloved hand. However, he had been unable to respond to anything I had said, and showed no response to painful stimuli. I was a teenaged kid, with limited first aid training, and even I knew how bad it was. Leslie put the films onto a light box and then illuminated it, letting us look them over before explaining them. I found myself getting back up to my feet in order to get a closer look, being sure to stay out of the other's view. A skull was on each first one, the bullet wound I had been the most concerned by. The brain mass was translucent with the occasional folds outlined. Located in the front of the skull, a bullet's silhouette was clearly defined in contrast with the light shades of the cranial tissue. The next film was of the chest, ribs overlaying the outlines of organs. The bullet had shattered two of the ribs and had lodged itself near the spine rather than launch out his back. The body armor had failed to prevent it from entering but had eaten its momentum to keep it from exiting. The third film was of the abdomen, evident from the faded outlines of the intestines and digestive organs. A portion of the liver was intensely white and the bullet could be barely seen in the center of color. "My lord," Montoya muttered from the rear, "my words exactly." We were able to remove the bullet from the liver and stop the blood flow. He threw a clot halfway through the procedure, blocked the hepatic artery and the flow of oxygen to this lobe of the liver. Unfortunately, we had to remove it. For the second bullet, he was lucky it didn't penetrate the spine. It was an inch from the cord itself. Easily removed, however. Minimal damage the chest cavity, considering the splinters of the rib cage. What about the third one? I asked. There is pressure building up in the cranial sac. I feared an aneurysm, but we relieved the pressure by drawing excess blood out and it hasn't returned, yet. At this point, if the bullet were removed, it would cause more harm than good. In fact, it probably would kill him. Maybe later when he's stable, but even then, the invasive nature of the procedure would most likely do more harm than good. Gordon asked weakly, is he stable? Almost, Commissioner. His vitals are still low, which from the blood loss is expected. We've been pumping in blood and plasma through a central line for the last 3 hours and I've started him on some steroids to help maintain the pressure on his brain. Right now, his EEG readings are hopeful, but he is comatose. Trying to fight back memories of my father, crippled and on his deathbed after being held captive in Haiti, I inquired, is he on a respirator? Leslie nodded, as a precaution. He had fairly good breath sounds and autonomic responses coming in, but if he takes a turn for the worst, I'd prefer to be safe rather than sorry. Turn for the worse, can we see him? I continued. Not yet. I'd like to wait and get his blood pressure and his pulse up a bit. If you want, you can look through the window of the recovery room, but that's all until he is less critical. The Gordon rose to his feet and joined Nightwing as they followed Leslie back down the hall. Bullock and Montoya stayed behind and I didn't realize I had as well until I felt Agrel's hand on my forearm. 5 minutes earlier, I wanted to barge into recovery, to make sure he was alive. I could barely move my feet. After nodding at her, I followed Batgirl down the hall towards the recovery area. As we passed the surgery room, several glanced in, myself included, and saw a horrific sight. The floor was bathed in bright red blood. Wadded and saturated gauze pads were everywhere, as well as bloodied instruments. In a metal bowl that rested on the counter next to the door sat a clump of bloody liver tissue that peeked through the blue strial draping. I felt my stomach churn. He was alive. They had raised the dead. Gordon's face quivered when he passed the surgery room and I noticed that Barbara had reached over and squeezed his hand. At the end of the hall there was a large room with numerous beds available for post-operation patients. The lights were dimmed and the glows of heart monitors could easily be seen. From my rear location of the group, I couldn't see very well and was thankful for it. Nightwing was the first to look through the massive window and I was surprised to see his lower lip trembling. If anything, always remained optimistic, lighthearted, holding back his emotion nearly as well as Bruce. Leaving Batgirl, I stepped forward slowly and stood at his side, absorbing the sight before us. The hero, the man they all looked up to, was bandaged like a mummy. His entire skull was wrapped in white gauze except his nose, mouth and right eye. The site of the wound was already bleeding through the material. His chest was bare and was also wrapped from his collarbone to his hips. His limp arms were attached to several IV lines and pulse recording devices. We had all forced ourselves for a majority of our lives to become emotionally detached to intense situations. Those in disguise, even more so. However, among those that stood before the picture window, not a single soul wasn't affected. Not a single eye was dry. V 3 days passed. 72 hours and not so much of a finger twitch. The only sign of improvement was that the subdural swelling had responded to the steroids and Leslie had felt comfortable taking him off of the ventilator. With Bruce breathing on his own, we all had found a small surge of hope amidst the ever-growing fear of the inevitable. His temperature had been alarmingly high after the first 24 hours, but after high-powered IV antibiotics, his system had calmed and his vitals had returned to normal. An infection was the last thing he needed to fight off. Bruce never gave up, I kept reminding myself. No matter how high the odds were stacked against him, he never surrendered. Between sitting at Bruce's bedside and working at the clock tower, the first 3 days after Pasquale had flown by. Thankfully, the shootout had occurred late at night and had not been attended by some of the more notorious thrill-seeking investigative reporters. Nevertheless, words had traveled throughout Gotham's underbelly that the Bat was down, possibly even dead. Needless to say, the criminals had waited a day, testing the waters before hitting the streets with a fury. A welcome distraction. Tim and Cass had been fighting back as best they could, fighting for Gotham, fighting for Bruce. After signing off early from the clock tower, a little after 2:30 in the morning, I made the 20-minute drive to Free Clinic. Even though my bed had been calling my name, I wouldn't have been able to get any meaningful sleep. In fact, The only sleep I had managed in 3 days had been slumped in the padded chair next to Bruce's gurney. Before heading through the back entrance, I took a moment to myself, hands still on the steering wheel of the idle SUV. Each visit had become harder than the last in spite of the marginal improvements. The day before, I had dropped by to bring lunch, for the staff and for who had been at Bruce's bedside all day. Entering the back storage room, where each had been treated over the years, I found him just sitting there, staring at Bruce's bandaged face. He hadn't acknowledged me until I had taken his free hand into mine. Since the shooting, he had either been hitting the streets of Gotham, at the free clinic or at the clock tower for much-needed meals and showers. Given that he rarely used his time off from the force, he had been able to take 7 consecutive personal days, leaving 7 days left for the year. Hopefully, he wouldn't need to break into his sick days or vacation time. My father had been by every night, without fail. According to Leslie, he always called ahead and never stayed more than 5 or 10 minutes, all of which was spent just staring down at his fallen friend. The day after it had happened, he had called me first, wondering if I would go with him. I had seen my father recover from being tortured, watch his city befall tragedy, and I had seen him bury the love of his life. And yet the look on his face as he watched Bruce breath in and out. Okay, I lied to myself before opening the car door. After a curt nod on the secluded room's door, I heard a muted response before opening and pushing it in. Shutting it, I looked to the rear of the room to see Leslie bent over, swathing a small flashlight over Bruce's exposed eyes. She had removed the encasing head bandage, with only white gauze covering him from the forehead up. Without being prompted, she replied, "Pupils are increasingly reactive, left is still a fraction sluggish." Moving to the other side of the gurney, I looked up to Bruce's still face. "Good to see that mug of yours, Bruce." "Hairy mug," Leslie smirked as she pocketed the penlight. "Well, now that the bandages are off, no doubt Alfred will be here in the next minute or so with a straight razor." I smiled as well before taking a cold, rough hand into mine. "Where is Alfred?" I gently persuaded him to get to some sleep, although he refused to go to the manor, so we compromised on my house. Knowing Leslie had also been up around the clock over the last 3 days, I offered, "I'll stay with him, if you'd like to rest yourself." She blinked slowly, before replying, setting a hand on Bruce's forearm, "I actually managed a bit of a nap this afternoon, it was pretty quiet today." I watched on as she checked the IV antibiotic and fluid bags hanging from the stand to her right. Taking advantage of her distraction, I scanned my eyes over the medical readout displays on the EKG and EEG. His vitals were well within range, his low pulse being the exception, but being that physically fit it was understandable. Although where his heart was beating away, his brain activity showed only small waves and dips. There was a spike earlier in the temporal, frontal and parietal electrodes. My eyes lit up. Really, when was this? Around 10 or so, had dropped by for a quick visit. Called me back in when the EEG started fluctuating. He hadn't told me during the night, probably as a way of not giving me false hope. I'd have to smack him for it later. "That's a good sign, he's making his way back to us," Leslie had offered before excusing herself. No doubt she had a number of other patients waiting for her. Alone, I found my eyes returning to Bruce's face and my thoughts drifting to dark places. With all of his strength, all that he had overcome in his life, would he be able to defeat a coma? Even when Bane nearly killed him, he woke after a few hours. It was the ultimate battle, because the strong will and tenacity had once thrived on were useless against the enemy he was currently fighting. All because of a fraction of a second, a wrong turn down an alley. The night he had been shot had started like any other, routine patrols followed by a visit to the GCPD. My father had asked for masked backup in the capture of Henri Pasquale and his fellow drug-dealing understudies at one of the cover businesses. La Belle Fleur. The Beautiful Flower. The police had barricaded the 2-story brick building as SWAT members prepared to barge in. The men inside were taken by surprise, disabled and rendered useless with the help of extra-strength gas pellets. The plan was a standard, one that had always ended with the bad guys coughing and puking their guts out, the worst of said bad guys even sporting bruises and bumps. Weeks of investigation ending in a firefight with minimal loss and injury, paddy wagons filled to capacity, all thanks to the Caped Crusaders. That time had been different. Robin and Batgirl had stayed outside, taking out thugs as they fled the smoke-filled building. They had worked far more efficiently than the SWAT members who were too busy pointing their guns and shouting orders. 2 of the 3 men remaining in the building had flown out of the central ground floor window, followed quickly by the goateed ringleader. Seemingly, a job well done, a front-page story for the Gazette and another success for the Caped Crusaders. That as until Pasquale staggered to his feet, ripped a semi-automatic from a SWAT officer. In a matter of seconds, Pasquale had pulled the trigger, my father's life had flashed before his eyes and a dark figure leapt in the path of 3 armor-piercing bullets. Given that he was needed for the conviction, SWAT had simply beaten Pasquale, pummeling him rather than shooting him. My father had closed his eyes before diving to the pavement, hoping to find shelter behind a squad car. Bullock had grabbed him by the arm, ripping him back to his feet before taking off towards Pasquale, leaving my father confused. But not for long. While we had waited for Bruce to get out of surgery that first night, he had confided in me, telling me the events through his eyes. The fear that had raced through him at the sight of a very large, very still body lying in a very large pool of blood. And there his savior lies, and may never rise again. I have pondered since that night the odds of him waking up. Leslie had given him at least 40-60, although her numbers were still optimistic. Ever being able to function on a somewhat normal level, 30-70. And ever being able to be up to standard again, 20-80. And the chances of him ever being able to take on his nocturnal counterpart ever again, 10-90. Not very good odds, even for Batman. Even upon waking, the aftermath suffered could range from simply have a scar on his brow to being riddled with brain damage. I had read several texts that Leslie had on brain injuries, and the possibilities had my guts in knots. Since the bullet was in the left frontal lobe of the brain, his right side motor skills would be the most likely to suffer. Fine motor skills, walking and balance would be off, if possible at all. Vision and hearing were also likely to suffer, as well as speech and critical thinking and reasoning skills. All of the things he thrived on, and lastly, memory. Leslie consulted with a neurologist in Boston and had sent him the radiographs, MRI scans and pertinent medical data. Apparently, he specialized in unique brain injuries, including gunshot wounds. He concluded that another possibility would be complete amnesia. Not just memories of friends and family, but of language, math and social behaviors. If this was the case, it would require complete rehabilitation, from infancy up. Thankfully, the door opened, revealing Alfred and Leslie. They were swiftly followed by who had changed out of his Nightwing suit and into a pair of dirty jeans and a wrinkled t-shirt, both fitting his exhausted face and chaotic hair. After he offered me a tired smile, he walked up behind me, putting his hands on my shoulders before leaning over to look down at Bruce. Leslie had a lightness to her face that hadn't been there when she had left a few minutes earlier, and Alfred looked positively cheerful. Feeling out of the loop, I had looked up at S. stubbled chin, well? Smirked down at me before glancing to Leslie. It's all yours, Doc. Leslie had returned to her post at Bruce's bedside before she announced, he's been stable for 24 hours, I think. He's ready to go home. He already has all of the equipment he needs. Besides, this dank, dark room isn't the best when it comes to warm, healing environments. Added after letting go of my shoulders, yeah, he'll kill us if he wakes up here. I squeezed Bruce's cold hand. You wouldn't, would you, Bruce? Passing, I heard Leslie ask to bring around one of the medical transport vehicles that Leslie used on the rare occasion she needed to transfer a patient to another hospital. He was quick to head back into the hall. Still keeping Bruce's hand in mine, I watched as Leslie unplugged the EKG and EEG electrodes from the machines rather than removing them from under the bandages. She then proceeded to remove the oxygen cannula from under his nose before setting a mask over his face, the clear tube leading to a portable tank. Once ready for transport, I exited the small room to make way for the stretcher. I watched on as Leslie, Alfred, and moved him from the gurney and then strapped him in for the ride. Home, sweet home. With Leslie and Alfred riding up in the town car, I opted to ride beside in the unmarked ambulance. We were silent until hitting a red light before the St. James North exit. When the light turned green and hadn't accelerated, I finally looked over to see his death grip on the steering wheel. I reached out and gently touched his tense forearm. He's going to be okay. He always pulls through. Pressing gently on the gas, he nodded, gripping the steering wheel tighter. For the duration of the ride, Leslie had not uttered a single word. Where my eyes had been staring intently on the ambulance before us, Hers had been directed to her hands as they rested in her lap. We arrived at the manor moments after Master and Ms. Barbara, and I carefully followed Master as he pulled around behind the garage to the rear service entrance. Aside from rare guests and events hosted at the manor, the front door remained locked and unused. It was where Master tried sneaking into the manor on his intermittent visits, hoping to gain access to the kitchen before being discovered. Following a rigorous day of academics, it was where Master Tim entered the manor before quickly making his way down into the cave, more often than not with Miss Cassandra following after him. And lastly, each weekday evening between 5 and 6, depending on traffic, Master Bruce quietly opened the service door, sighed before hanging his jacket and Alfred? I felt Leslie's hand on my arm, shaking me from painful reverie. I had automatically pulled into the garage and had cut the ignition. Judging by the pained look on her face, we had been parked for some time. "Are you all right, old man?" she asked, forcing a smile. Nodding curtly, I returned the fake smile and lied, "But of course, my dear." "But of course," she leaned over and gently kissed my cheek before stepping out of the car. I followed suit, straightening my wool coat before locking the car, pocketing the keys and stepping out of the garage and into the cool, dark pre-dawn air. With sunrise still an hour and a half away, the birds had just begun to wake, ready for a warm, May day. Master Bruce would have just been returning from patrols. I reached the ambulance just as Master had opened the back doors. Given that he had endured a number of challenges in his relationship with Mentor, his devotion for Master Bruce had been unyielding in the last few days. Whether it was as his masked alter ego, trying to bring order to a city shaken to its core, or helping turn him so that Leslie was able to change bandages. It had taken nearly losing him to bring them closer than they had been in years. Leslie chose to stay behind while I excused myself to the third floor in order to prepare the master bedroom. I reasoned that demand of time led me to take the elevator, not that I was exhausted. Regrettably, I had only been back to the manor for fresh clothing and to receive a delivery of groceries. With Master Bruce in his rightful place, I would finally be able to return some of my attention on keeping the great house in order. After stepping off onto the third floor, I retrieved fresh linens and proceeded to the master bedroom. Opening both of the double doors to accommodate for moving the stretcher into the room, I moved towards the bed, pausing as I noticed the comforter was rumpled and pillows were displaced. Stepping forward, I set the fresh sheets and blankets on the bed before taking a seat, my lower lip trembling as I thought back to the Thursday evening prior to the shooting. Master Bruce had returned from the city mid-afternoon, and I had expected him to endure a hearty workout, a shower and an hour or two at the computer prior to heading back into Gotham. Instead, he had met me in the kitchen, accepted a glass of ice water before saying, "I'm going upstairs, wake me by 6. I had forgotten to fix the bed afterwards. Regaining my composure, I promptly stood and began removing the bedding and pillows, letting them fall to the floor rather than being partially folded and set neatly over the back of the chaise. As I began fitting the fresh sheets over the mattress, I heard the door creak softly from behind me. Rather than look back, I had offered, "Don't you make an excellent doorstop, Master?" He approached, quietly observing as I deftly tucked in the sheets and recovered the pillows. Master offered a hand laying out the down covers, but when I reached across to correct a rumple he left, he smirked, "Alfred, he's going to mess it up in 5 seconds. Your point, sir?" He smiled and tilted his head, "Never mind. Where's Tim? I'll have him help me move Bruce into the bed." Thinking back to the late-night message on Leslie's answering machine from the young man, I answered, resting his eyes on the couch in the den I believe. "I'll go grab him." He looked to the door. "Leslie and Barbara are coming up in the elevator. Want me to leave Bruce in the hall or?" I shook my head. "No, let's bring the stretcher in." Following him into the corridor, I sighed at the sight of the loaded stretcher, waiting just outside of the elevator. I had intended on returning downstairs to aid Master in unloading and maneuvering the gurney, but apparently he had given way to his anxiousness. As he took the head, I gripped the cold steel bars by the foot and gently directed while Master provided the momentum. Once parallel with the king-sized bed, Master excused himself, adding that he would also head down to the cave to retrieve the monitoring equipment. He squeezed Master Bruce's arm before departing. "Be right back, Bruce." "Master Bruce, I believe the first order of business is a good shave." The portable EKG blipped and he exhaled quietly. "Very well, sir." Being with him at Leslie's had been a horrid experience, notably because of the dreary, sterile atmosphere. Sitting at his bedside, for so many years should have made the experience moderately sustainable, but every minute spent in the small treatment room had been nearly as unbearable as every second spent aiding in surgery. It was impossible not to think back over every major injury he had endured, namely when Bane had nearly killed him not 3 years earlier. The fear, the anxiety from watching him lay there, comatose, paralyzed, barely alive. For years I had been the one they had looked to for support and guidance, and somehow I had managed to hold strong until Master Bruce opened his eyes. When he had woken, he had believed himself to be a failure, broken physically and mentally. I couldn't help but wonder what he would think after this latest hurdle. When Master and Master Tim arrived, I aided them in setting up the monitors, medical supplies stand in addition to the ventilator and resuscitation cart. Just in case. Hanging a temporary metal hook over the top of the headboard, I moved the IV bags, hoping to make moving Master Bruce less difficult. Stepping back, the young men moved forward, carefully undoing the sheet of the stretcher in order to cradle the limp body. On the count of 3, they hefted together, lifting their mentor and setting him on the turned-down bed. As Master carefully pulled the spare sheet out from under Master Bruce, I noticed a twitch of a hand that hadn't moved in 3 days. Sensory perception or simply autonomic reaction? I heard muted voices approach from behind, and I had turned to see Leslie and Ms. Barbara passing through the open doorway. Glancing back to the bed, I noticed Master Tim's eyes had begun to water, his face painfully emotional. As I stepped forward, in hopes to comfort him, the young man suddenly turned and raced towards the door. Thankfully, he was intercepted by Leslie's warm embrace. She began to lead him out of the room, rubbing his back as she offered soothing words in his ear. Even though he had been a part of the family for such a short time, the young lad had endured far too much tragedy, all with the bravery of a much older and wiser man. It was then my attention was brought back the bed as Master gasped, "Leslie, he's waking up." Looking over Master Bruce's face, I was just as shocked to see eyes fluttering, lips starting to come to life and his fingers slowly fluttering. "Thank you." Being the closest, I retrieved a flashlight from the top drawer of the medical stand, dilating his eyes and speaking slowly in his soft voice. As I began asking if he knew where he was and if he felt any pain, Master Bruce began purposeful blinking, but not in the code we had long since agreed on. Once for yes, twice for no. His lids fluttered in confusion and fear. Master stepped forward, calling out Master Bruce's name as he touched his hands. Master Bruce witched in response, as if frightened by the gesture. Having released Master Tim, Leslie had stepped forward and began taking note of physiology and vitals, all the while trying to communicate with him. As the panic in his eyes increased, I noted Leslie's face was growing with concern. I stepped forward, encouraging Master to step back, doing my best to lock eyes with Master Bruce. Blue eyes once so decisive and bold were glancing about the room like a wild animal cornered. "Alfred, what's—" Master had started. I turned to face him, ordering rather than asking him to accompany Master Tim and Ms. Barbara out of the room. When he began to protest, I snapped, "Now, Richard." The young man looked to the figure on the bed once more before nodding, crossing the room quickly before guiding a teary-eyed Master Tim out of the room. Before he shut the door, they looked back at Master Bruce one last time only to see him hyperventilating in fear. As soon as I shut the double doors, Tim frantically asked, "What the hell is happening to him?" Panicking, I forced myself to take a breath before offering, "Some confusion can be expected after being in a coma. Let Alfred and Leslie take care of him for now." Confusion. Bruce had looked as if he was reliving every single one of his worst nightmares all at once. Knowing Alfred wasn't going to let us back in until they had figured things out, I turned to face and Barbara while putting on my best everything is going to fine face. "What should we do?" Barbara asked, her tired face suddenly alive with worry. A growl ripping through my stomach inspired me. "Well, it's almost 5. I say we go downstairs and work on some breakfast and—" Tim shook his head in disbelief. "What? How can you think about food?" Barbara came to my rescue. "He's right. There's nothing we can do right now." Tim went to speak but she cut him off. "Tim, sitting outside this room is going to give you ulcers." He looked to the master bedroom at the sound of Leslie's muted voice conflicting with unintelligible sounds. "Tim." I stepped forward and put a hand on his shoulder. "Tim, come on, we'll fill up, coffee it up and then come back up here, it's going to be a long day." His eyes still on the door as the voices rose, he slowly nodded. "Fine, just for a minute." As we rode down in the elevator, I felt Barbara's hand sneak over and grasp mine briefly. When I looked down at her, she smiled before nodding towards Tim. My eyes found him leaning against the back of the paneled car, arms crossed over his chest and face in turmoil. He would be 16 years old in July, and where most boys his age were worried about passing their road test, he was dealing with an unimaginable tragedy. Hell, I was in my 20s and I was barely holding it together. Passing into the open archway of the kitchen, I patted Tim on the shoulder. Rule number 1, no mess. Any mess made, we'll say the back door was left open and raccoons did it. Tim smirked weakly before taking a seat on one of the island counter's stools. As I perused the refrigerator, Barbara excused herself to the bathroom. Without her input, I decided to go with a timely breakfast as opposed to boisterous. Knowing that busy hands help distract busy minds, I put Tim to work chopping up peppers, potatoes and onions for a hash. With him somewhat hard at work, I went about making a big skillet of scrambled eggs, although not the variety I was used to making with cheddar cheese and a third of a bottle of Frank's Red Hot sauce. Little too early for that, even for me. Barbara returned just as I was filling an iron griddle with the diced vegetables, and when she asked if there was coffee was ready, I swore, "Sorry, I forgot about it." Typical, letting your stomach lead the way, she joked before approaching the automatic coffee maker. It was one of the few electronics Alfred allowed to remain out on his countertops. The entire battalion of cooking appliances each had their place in one of 24 cupboards, coming out to serve their purpose, followed by a thorough cleaning before being put away. For April Fool's one year, I had switched them all around. Alfred had made me porridge for breakfast as a means of punishment. The good old days. Not 15 minutes later, breakfast was ready and we were doing our best to eat in the nook. The looming silence and pre-dawn darkness had done little for our appetites, not to mention the worry of what was happening in a particular third-floor bedroom. After barely being able to empty half of his plate, Tim rose from the table and said he was going to wash up and change for the day. Before leaving he had added, "I'm calling into school, but I'll tell Dad I went in early." "Excellent sidekick cover story," Barbara replied. Tim nodded before commenting, "Getting a little too good at them, lately." Alone, I finally allowed myself to sit back with a heavy sigh. Given how hectic things had been over the last 3 days, I really hadn't allotted myself to let things sink in. Optimistically, I had kept telling myself that everything was going to be okay once he woke up. He'd be out of commission for a month or two, but we would take care of the city. Then, once Leslie had given him the all clear, he'd suit back up and we'd all live happily ever after. The terrified look on Bruce's face had crushed my hopes. I looked at her for a moment and then concentrated on the cooling eggs before me. When he started blinking, I thought it was code, but it was just blinking, and then I rose to my feet, pacing back and forth. Jesus, Babs, he was hyperventilating. He was supposed to wake up and, he should have. He should have just the sonofas once more and finished him off. Barbara had pushed herself away from the table, placing herself in my path as I about faced. My fists ached as I clenched them, and when she reached for my hand, I loosened them. "I'm sorry. This could have been your dad, don't be." "I still am." She nodded before letting go of me. "I know." After returning to the table, Barbara continued, "Suppose I should go down to the cave, lure Cass up here." "She came up after patrols?" I asked, as I joined her in collecting the used dishware. Nodding, she replied, "She was still in Bryantown when I signed off, and when we left the clinic I called her and she was in the village. I told her to come up when she was done." With the sky lightening outside the bay windows, I wondered if Barbara would find her in the cave or the tireless Cassandra Cain was still in the city, brutalizing thugs of all shapes and sizes. Although we had all taken Bruce's injury to heart, our most recent addition to the family was suffering just as if she had been with us all along. Cassandra's devotion to Bruce was unquestionable, and seeing her revert to her near-mute ways after the shooting had been difficult to bear. We all had endured tragedy in our lives, but Cassandra's horrific upbringing had topped us all. Barbara and I agreed that becoming a part of the family had been her salvation, that the young girl looked up to Bruce as the father she never had but the one she had always dreamed of. A dream that wasn't meant to end. After Tim returned, we quickly cleaned up the kitchen and opted to wait downstairs for news from Alfred and Leslie. As the boys turned right towards the den, I kept to the left in order to head to the elevator once more. To access the cave, I retrieved my key ring to open the small hatch, then pressed my palm to the scanner and spoke my passcode aloud for audio clearance. While Bruce's was a line from Faust, mine was from Fargo. I'm not sure I agree with you 100% on your police work, there, Lou. Once the computer decided I was in fact Barbara Gordon, the elevator car shifted and then slowly descended into the floor of the cave. Thankfully, she had made the trek to the cave, although rather than coming up to join us, she had changed into LYRCA pants and a tank top and was in the training bay. Following the sound of chains chiming, I found her on the gymnast rings in the midst of inverse. The quivering in her arms and the redness in her face said she had been holding herself upside down for some time. Rather than interrupt her, I watched on as she allowed her straight form to complete 2 full rotations before hesitating once more on the inverse stand, followed by 2 backwards rotation. As she dismounted using a double tuck with her arms straight out to the side, I moved closer to the dark blue mats and grabbed a towel off of a rack. After I tossed it to her, she caught it and wiped her sweat-covered face. "Been back long?" I asked. She shrugged. When I asked how long specifically, she shrugged again, "Half hour." Watching her stretch her back out, I informed her of what had happened upstairs. A lightness washed over her face that quickly vanished when I had explained what condition we had left Bruce in. "Okay. Alfred and Leslie are with him now, but we're in the den waiting for them, when you're ready." "Ready now," she offered. "Don't want to wash up?" Shaking her head, Cassandra explained, "Not done working." "Of course." She joined me in the elevator after grabbing a bottle of water from the small fridge on the far wall of the training bay. As the car began its ascension, my cell phone chirped from my pocket and I was quick to answer. "Hello?" "Hey, sweetheart. It's just me," my father's tired voice greeted me. "Did I wake you?" "No, I've been up for a bit. Oh, I just called the clinic. They said Leslie left with a patient in an ambulance. Barbara, I think something happened to him." "Dad. They took him home." "What? Lying," I explained. "I called around midnight, just to check in. They said he had been stable long enough for transport." He cleared his throat, a nervous habit of his, and asked, "Anything else? Any change?" I nodded, biting my lip before saying, "Dad, he's still unconscious, but Leslie said there was some EEG activity, so hopefully it won't be long." Damn it, I knew I should have gone down again last night. "Maybe you could still visit him." "No, Barbara, I don't want to intrude." The elevator doors opened and Cassandra led the way out. "Dad, he's your friend, I'm sure they wouldn't see it as an intrusion." Silence and then, "I guess, well, get some sleep, sweetheart." "You, too, Dad." By the time I had joined the others in the den, Cass had taken a seat on the leather couch beside Tim. Rather than move onto the couch, I remained in my chair and moved to sit beside. I told him about my father's call, and more importantly, how concerned he had been. "You did the right thing, not telling him he's awake," nodded as he crossed his arms over his broad chest. "Are we going to wait until he's back in the tights before telling my father he's even awake?" Winced before responding, "No one needs to know yet. We don't even know what his condition is." "Yes we do." Leslie's voice came from the door. We looked in her direction to see her as well as Alfred standing just inside the room. She walked forward as she continued, "He has lost all forms of communication. Speech, sign, writing. From what I can tell, he has no understanding of what happened to him, or for that matter, he has no understanding of who anyone is. I tried to do a neurological exam but I couldn't get him to follow my directions. The only good news I have is that he appears to have full use of his vision, hearing and pain receptors." Lifted a hand to cover his mouth as Tim and Cass left their slack jaws uncovered. Since I had known this was a possibility from the beginning, I was quick to ask about his other injuries. "What about the bullet by his spine?" Leslie nodded. "No permanent damage that I can see. All of his reflexes are a little sluggish, but in order." Tim spoke as he rose from the couch. "Can we see him?" "No, I have him sedated until we can truly ascertain the extent of the brain damage. For now, I'd prefer if only Alfred and myself dealt with him. Less confusion leads to less pain for him." The silence of the room allowed my head to echo with Leslie's words. Brain damage. A man I admired, honored and loved, a man who knew everything about anything and more, had lost what meant the most to him. His mind. When Bane had paralyzed him, he had confided in me that he finally understood how I was able to think so clearly in the chair. He had admitted at being frustrated, and also intrigued with how everything had gained a more potent perspective. I had told him that without the body we still had our better half. Now it was reversed, he had his body but no longer could he control it. I left Leslie to answer questions for my concerned charges in order to tend to Master Bruce. He had reached such a panicked state that only the most powerful of sedatives were able to put him into a fitful slumber. Although Leslie was far more concerned with his inability to communicate, I was unable to look beyond the feral look in his eyes as they shot bolts of pain into my soul. It had reminded me of when he was a child, waking in the middle of the night screaming for his father to save him. Entering the master bedroom, I was pleased to find him snoring softly in a peaceful, albeit drug-induced, slumber. Upon closer inspection, the muscles around his eyes twitched randomly, a sure sign of the nightmares that plagued him. As Leslie had been conducting her examinations, Master Bruce had desperately tried to communicate with stuttering mumbles that went unexplained. His eyes danced violently, trying to understand the world around him. Even without all of the most expensive tests and doctors, I had known just by looking at him that something was terribly wrong. The powerful presence he once expelled, even in states of infirm, was no longer present. It was as if his spirit had left his body on the filthy patch of street, and I thought morbidly it was just as his parents had died. Only he hadn't left this world to join them. After dampening a washcloth with cold water, I moved to Master Bruce's bedside, placing it on his forehead. No, what he suffered was much worse, for no matter how terrible, everyone cherished their memories. The twitching ceased at his eyes and he sighed deeply with content. Sleep, young sir. No harm shall come your way this day. Letting my thoughts run wild, I sat at his bedside for another hour, watching for any sign of him waking and yet at the same time hoping he would not. With our worst fears realized, a long road to recovery was growing before all of us. He would have to relive his entire life, so to speak, building his way back to what he was step by step. In some fashion, he had been given a fresh start through tragedy, one that I was beginning to wonder about. Given that he was able to learn once more the skills of life, would he be able to learn the skills that had led him down the path of vigilantism? Would he want to? My thoughts, both light and dark, were interrupted as Leslie entered the room. She smiled at me before opening the blackout drapes, letting in soft, pink rays of sunlight. As she joined me by the bed, she kissed the top of my head before sitting beside Master Bruce, barely denting the mattress with her petite frame. At least he's comfortable now. I nodded, removing the used cloth. That he is. As she took his hand into hers, she sighed. I wish I could help him. God. At least to be able to communicate with him, but if he can't speak or even sign. Master Bruce has a way of overcoming obstacles. I'm fairly certain that this qualifies, I assured her. Taking on a mob by himself is nothing compared to this, Alfred. I watched as she gently touched his rough cheek. We both had been left as surrogate parents when Master Thomas and Ms. Martha had been slain so many years ago. We had shared the hardships of raising such an intelligent and yet disturbed young boy. Knowing the future his parents had wanted nothing but the best for him, we had done everything in our power to allow their dream to be realized. It was with our guidance and love that he had grown from that boy into a far more intelligent and disturbed man. Now, as his future slipped through our fingers, it seemed that I was not the only one who was rethinking how he had been raised. I watched from the door. Dr. Leslie and Alfred looked so sad as they watched him sleep. I hadn't been able to sleep since he was shot. I knew it was my fault. If I had followed him into the building, he would have been okay. He was awake, but still, he could die. All my fault. It had been hard, listening to Dr. Leslie tell us about his condition. Barbara and Tim were talking about how things were going to change. I didn't have anything to say, so I had left. Walking upstairs, I drifted through the halls. Wandering put me at ease. Sitting still was torture. Being helpless. Dr. Leslie got up and walked over to the bathroom, letting me see him on the bed. They had removed some of the bandages from his face, looked like he was sleeping. The last time I had seen him awake had been when he was shot. Laying on the pavement, Robin and the big detective pressing on his wounds. Commissioner holding his hand, calling out his name. He was looking around, looking up at us. Seemed okay, considering he was bleeding so much. Cassandra? A voice asked softly from behind me. I drew a breath, then turned to see. I didn't say anything, as usual. You can't be up here. He grabbed my arm softly and guided me towards the inner hall. I know. When we were away from the doors, he spoke louder. Then why are you up here? I don't know. Wanted to see him. We all do, but we have to wait. Right now, seeing him like he is. Ran a hand through his short hair. It will upset him, and he needs to rest, to get better. If. What? If he get better? His eyes narrowed. We can't think like that. We don't know anything. It might be temporary. It might fade away in a few days, a few weeks. Barbara always saw the best in everything while Bruce saw the worst. I guess I was like Bruce. When see him? Few days, weeks? He paused before answering. No, once he's able to stay calm we can see him. Leslie just wants to make sure he's not going to shock his system with too much happening at once. I nodded, knowing I wasn't going to wait that long. All my fault. After a moment, I asked, who out with me? What? He asked, not completely fluent in my short language. At night, I stuck my index fingers up to the sides of my head, imitating a cowl. Robin, of course, and myself. For however long you need me. You be him? Or you? His eyes darted back and forth as he figured out what I meant. He swallowed hard before answering. I think for the time being. Until he recovers, that is. Be him. Nodding, replied, I suppose, unless you don't. Okay me. I pointed at myself and then pointed to him. Okay you? I've done it once before, but he asked me to. Now, what other choice do we have? My eyes found the bedroom door as I nodded. He set a hand on my shoulder, squeezing before saying, it's going to be, okay Cass. He's alive. He's awake, that in itself is a miracle. No, he was physically able of coming back from the bullet wounds. Alfred said he had been through worse. As guided me back towards the stairs, I thought that a miracle would be if he got his mind back. If Batman came back, and then it had been darkness as 3 shots ring out. I had expected fierce pain to fill my body, but I was only met with cold pavement. When my eyes had opened, I saw officers running towards me. As I had tried to tell them I hadn't been hit, they had passed right by me and continued on towards the restaurant. They had been running to the dark, caped figure lying on the ground 20 feet in front of me. Alone, I had somehow made it to my feet before stumbling to him, not out of pain but shock. He was invincible, my mind had repeated, he can't be hurt. Robin was kneeling in front of him, pressing his hands on a blood-spurting hole in Batman's chest. Harvey Bullock had ripped a sleeve off of his trench coat and was staunching the flow from a belly wound. Bright red arterial blood was everywhere. Please, I had pleaded silently, don't let him die. I had knelt next to him and found his hand, which was slick with his own blood. His jaw had grown paler with each passing second. Although I had done my best to meet his eyes as he nodded at me, I had been unable to look away from the gaping dark hole on his left brow. With Robin and Bullock doing their best to stop the bleeding, I had done what I could to keep him conscious by talking to him, gripping his gloved hand and towards the end, patting his face. It hadn't been long before his grip on my hand weakened and turned cold. It was usually then that I found myself shooting up in bed, covered in a cold sweat after reliving the worst night of my life once more. On some level, I had been thankful that I hadn't dreamed about him being loaded into the ambulance and how the medics had called out orders, namely, starting compressions. Mentally wasted after that first night after he had been shot, I had forced myself to work a full day in order to keep my mind occupied. After visiting him at the free clinic, I had made my way home, downed a fifth of scotch and then slept fitfully. Upon waking, I had instinctively looked to my hands to see that were clean of his blood. I had tried to fool myself into thinking that it had all been a dream, that it had just been a delusion of my aged and overstressed mind. In the darkness of my empty house, I had walked to the kitchen, microwaved a stale cup of coffee and instinctively called Barbara. No answer. Before setting my cell phone down, I had noticed that the display had listed a missed call from none other than my daughter. Listening to her recorded, tired voice, I had a list of facts to prove that it hadn't been a dream. Hey, Dad, it's just me. It's a little after midnight, so I figured I'd call the clinic and check in on him for you. Leslie said his vitals are good but his temperature is still high. Hopefully the IV antibiotics will kick whatever is brewing. If you go see him tomorrow, let me know, I'll go with you. Love you. It hadn't been a dream, it had been a nightmare. Although he had saved my life numerous times over the years, I had a horrible feeling that he would never be able to do so again. Never return to the war he had taken upon himself. Never see his family or friends again, never wake I had taken a Valium that night, hoping that a numb sleep would keep me from seeing my friend fall once more. But as I had for 3 nights in a row, I jumped up in bed, the only light belonging to the orange glow of the street lamp outside my window. After catching my breath, I reached for my glasses on the night table and donned them just as the alarm clock shifted to 5:15. I nearly reached for my cell phone to call Barbara but feared to wake her in case she had been able to find sleep. Rather than give in to the impulse of rising at such an hour, I reclined back against the pillows, letting my left arm stretch out over the empty space. Sarah had been gone for nearly a year and a half, and yet I still couldn't find it in myself to sleep in the middle of the bed. The only peace of mind I found had been knowing the Joker was never going to see the light of day thanks to his federal incarceration in Virginia, seeing how Arkham had never been able to keep him under wraps. One less horror to haunt my nights. I managed to lay there for 15 minutes before calling the clinic, hoping for any good news they could offer. Instead, a nurse informed me that Dr. Tompkins had left to transport a patient. No, pushing back the covers, I swung my legs over the end of the mattress before dialing Barbara. After she confirmed my suspicions that they had taken Batman from the clinic, she tried to reassure me by saying that it was a good sign he was stable enough to move. When she suggested that I may still be able to visit with him, I had instinctively shut her down. No matter how close of a friendship I shared with their mentor, his protégés would do anything to protect his secrets. After hanging up, I carefully set the phone back down on the oak nightstand rather than throwing it against the wall in frustration. Finally getting to my feet, I pulled on a dark terrycloth housecoat before making my way downstairs to the kitchen. Rather than warm up a cup of old coffee, I dumped the pot and washed it out before changing the filter and setting it to start a fresh brew. Barbara had dropped by the day before with groceries, knowing that I had seen the inside of a supermarket in over a week. I wouldn't be able to live without her. Sitting at the small kitchen table, I stared at the back door, thinking of countless late-night visits he had made, dropping of evidence, giving insights to sale cases and leads to crimes he had already solved. Gotham wouldn't be able to live without him. Carrot v. Carrot. It was dark. I couldn't see. I was lost, I knew it. It hurt to breathe, to move, to think. Not that I could think that much. It hurt. I just wish I knew what to do. It was so dark. I could sort of see. Not much light. The man was there. He was old. Am I old? No, just hurt. Can barely move. Where was she? The woman? And the young boy? Was there anyone? I wish I could have seen, but it was so dark. He said something, but it was all blurred. I could hear, right? Maybe I was blind, too. Where was she? She could help me. There, she had a cloth. Washing my chest. It was white. No, now it was red. She looked sad. I think. So dark. He made a light appear from somewhere, a soft light. I could see him better. White shirt, dark coat and pants. A small mustache, a frown. She was older, too. Blue blouse and tan pants, a smaller frown. Something burned on my side and I made some sort of noise, a squeak. They both looked at me and said something I couldn't understand. They looked even sadder. I wished it would be dark again. So I couldn't see them being sad. I closed my eyes. Sleep. Pretend to sleep. Carrot v. Carrot. Shortly after he opened them, Bruce clenched his eyes shut and made small ing noises. When I called his name softly, he made no verbal or physical response. Wherever he was, he didn't want to come out. I signaled to Alfred to remain silent as we stood next to the bed. Once 10 minutes passed, Bruce's eyes opened once more, revealing bloodshot whites and dilated pupils. Upon disregarding the bandages, his pale skin and rough jaw made him look like he had simply awoken from a rough night's sleep. Tentatively, he began to look around, squinting and blinking as if trying to focus his vision through willpower. Given the amount of cranial pressure he had endured in the first 12 hours following the shooting, I had feared damage to sensory nerves steaming off of his brain. Before I could begin to fear him suffering impaired vision, he stopped blinking and began scanning the room. Alfred put a hand on my elbow, pulling me back a stride. Bruce's right hand pushed down on the bed as if trying to prop himself up. He barely came off of the mattress before his face cringed in pain, the arm collapsing as he lay back down. I mused, respecting his body limits. His lips quivered before opening to bare his lower teeth. Working his jaw back and forth slowly as if trying to unhinge it, The very tip of his tongue peeked out and then snuck back in. Shortly after, his lips formed different shapes, but not as words. Going by my limited ability as a lip reader, he said something to the sort of, "Able me be ka nun." Although no vocalization had been made, it was a sign that he was trying to speak. My entire being wanted to run to him and provide comfort and encouragement, to try and reach out to him any way that would work. Staying in place, just 2 yards from the bed, I thought back on the panicked terror that had overtaken him when he had first opened his eyes a little over an hour earlier. Although I would be comforted by holding his hand or kissing his bandaged brow, I felt it would only startle him. Apparently, Alfred felt otherwise. Before I could stop him, Alfred stepped towards the bed, taking a seat on the edge before smiling down at his charge. Bruce had jerked slightly at his sudden appearance, but surprisingly relaxed after a jerking nod. As his lips began to move without coordinations once more, Alfred replied to the silent babble. As he listed off the injuries, I felt my eyes grow hot, thinking how it was as if it was just another morning, Bruce waking after being injured on the streets. "There we are, sir, no need to suffer on the account of a rumpled pillow," Alfred commented before puffing up the pillow behind Bruce's head. Bruce let his head roll to the side, his eyes finding me before he moved his lips again. Alfred continued his one-way conversation. "Yes, I'm afraid your injuries were quite severe, Master Bruce. Dr. Tompkins has been most kind in devoting her time to putting you back together." He then stood to his feet, straightening out his sweater before announcing he was going to fetch materials to clean Bruce up with. From the bed, Bruce had watched Alfred walk away, straining his neck when he could no longer see him. His breaths became heavy and forced, and rather than let him become upset, I took action. "It's all right, Bruce, he'll be right back," I said softly, before stepping up to the bed. "Far be it for Alfred to let you start the day unwashed." Bruce studied me intently, pursed his lips together and then offered another twitch of a nod. Acknowledgement, I hoped, rather than a neurological tic. Alone with him, I gently sat on the bed, setting my hand out next to Bruce's but not touching. Somehow, I managed to hold my smile as he looked up at me, without any hint of recognition in his eyes. "You gave us quite a scare, Bruce, one that I hope you won't be repeating anytime soon." His lip twitched and I found myself laughing out loud at the familiar gesture, even if it hadn't been intended. He wasn't out of the woods by any means, but perhaps it was a sign. The first of many in what would no doubt be a very long, painful road to recovery. One that, judging by the last 3 days, his family would be there to support, step by step. Alfred emerged from the bathroom with a hand towel and 2 small bowls, one with warm water, the other with shaving cream. Rather than his customary straight razor, I noticed that he had brought a safety razor. "How modern of you, Alfred," I commented. "It will have to do for the time being. Once we get you sitting upright, sir, it will be back to tradition." Another lip twitch. I rose from the bed and proceeded to clear the nightstand for Alfred to use. Pushing the lamp to the far corner, I collected the prepared IV bags and sterile packets of catheters, needles and syringes and set them on the nearby chaise. Returning, I watched on as Alfred tentatively wiped Bruce's face with the warm cloth before removing the oxygen cannula. Surprisingly, Bruce remained still, his eyes transfixed on Alfred's hands as they moved over him. Clean-shaven, hair brushed and face, neck and arms washed, Alfred rose from the bed once more, dashing to the last, "Master Bruce." Day. It was the first sound he had made outside of hyperventilating, and it was music to my ears. There had been such concentration in his eyes that I had found myself thinking back to observing him practice kata or weightlift in human amounts in the cave's training bay. Although, rather than physically testing himself, Master Bruce was trying himself mentally. Leslie and I looked down at him as his head rolled to the left and then to the right. After another 30 seconds of silence, he uttered, "Goo." Rather than simply stare down at him, dumbfounded, I resumed sitting on the edge of the bed, squeezing his thick forearm with my hand. "Is that so, Master Bruce?" "Duh," he said before looking up at my face. I felt Leslie's hands grasp my shoulder before I replied, "Yes, sir, I can hear you." "Duh. Triple A. Duh. I would beg to differ, sir. It certainly isn't your normal waking hour, but for others it is quite normal to be awake shortly after dawn." A wave of confusion washed over his face and his lips twitched. "Duh." As Master Bruce forced his head back against the pillows, I glanced up at Leslie, smiling at her shocked look of disbelief. Looking back to Master Bruce, he had relaxed his form although his face tightened before saying, I felt a wet drop on the back of my neck as Leslie's tears began to roll down her cheeks. I turned to offer her my handkerchief but she declined it. Master Bruce had resumed to repeat, until it had given way to wet coughs. I quickly moved to help him sit more upright, forcing pillows lower beneath him in order to support the weight I could not. After a hoarse bark, dark red phlegm was expelled from his mouth, covering his chest. As Leslie retrieved gauze to clean him with, I patted his back gently until the coughs gave way to slow breathing. There, Master Bruce, no doubt anyone would have struggled to expel that. Mostly mucus, she commented before stepping to the bathroom to dispose of it. Returning, she added, no doubt it was from the pleural effusion, stagnating in his bronchioles. Retrieving her stethoscope, she listened to his deep breaths as they entering his trachea, passed through the bronchi and at several points within the lungs. Prognosis? Breath sounds are much better, she nodded before hanging the device around the back of her neck. Well done, Bruce. As expected, she went about taking the remainder of his vitals, double-checking the numbers broadcasted on the monitors the old-fashioned way. As she flashed her pen light over both of his eyes, noting that the left was still sluggish, he blinked rapidly in protest. Taking after my lead in using normal conversation with him, Leslie apologized. I'm sorry, Bruce, it has to be done. He blinked at her again and then looked to me, licking his lips with an effort unworthy of the task. I nodded and he returned his gaze to her shocked face. After selecting an otoscope from the collection of instruments she had moved to the chaise, she proceeded to check his ears, at which he shook his head. Nah. Den. Oh, quit complaining and hold still, Leslie smiled sadly. Regarding me once more, I set a hand on his forearm again. Doctor's orders are not to be ignored, Master Bruce. Turmoil danced behind his eyes as confusion washed over his face once more, as if his greatest hero had turned out to be nothing but a fantasy. How can you pass up Zorro? I'm not the swashbuckling type, young sir. The night he had lost his parents, he had also lost innocence as two thunder cracks sounded in the dark. A young Master Bruce had returned that night not lost in the sleepy stupor of happiness from a night at the movies, but in the zombie-like trance of traumatic shock. Morbidly, I mused that while he had lost his chance at a normal life through tragedy, perhaps this latest event would grant him a second chance, perhaps. He seems comfortable, Leslie commented as she pocketed the otoscope and penlight in her smock top. I think was right. Him waking up at home would be more welcoming, even if he doesn't know where it. Her words faded as she crossed her hands over her chest. I rose to my feet in order to set my hands on her elbows. Leslie, he is alive and relatively well, both of which by any means are miracles. Whatever obstacles lie ahead, we will muster through them. Her eyes found Master Bruce's face. I hope so. He remained dormant for a time, staring off into nothingness until I sat down beside him once more. Mumbling, he lifted his right arm off of the mattress nearly 2 inches before letting it fall once more. When I said his name, he showed no sign of hearing me and proceeded to tilt his head back and dragged his right hand over his abdomen, reaching for mine. Grasping it softly, I ignored how cold and clammy his palm was. Very good, sir. His lips twitched again, this time smirking for a second before returning to the frown. More jargon fell from his lips, nothing more than a mixture of maons, consonants and vowels. As Leslie and I continued to converse with him, he responded by trying even harder. I smiled to see that concentration began to overcome the confusion on his face. Alfred and Leslie had stayed in Bruce's bedroom, alone, for the entire day. I had made 6 trips up to the 3rd floor, taking the steps 2 at a time, both going up and down. Each time I had knocked on the door, I had been met with the same reply. No, I couldn't come in. Barbara had returned to Gotham a little after noon, but where the former Batgirl seemed enthusiastic about the developments, the current had been solemn and woeful. Having spent the 3 previous days being able to sit by Bruce's bedside, it had been torture to not be able to look at him for a minute. I had a feeling Cassandra was going to take her frustration out on some unsuspecting criminal. Accepting defeat, Cassandra and I had lured Tim into the cave to spar and work out for the afternoon, before outlining patrols for that night. In Bloodhaven, I generally drifted through the boroughs looking for trouble, but in Bruce's city, I couldn't help but play by Bruce's rules. Before suiting up, I had decided to run upstairs one last time, hoping to talk some sense into Alfred, or at the very least kick the door down. As I walked quickly down the corridor leading to the master bedroom, I spotted Alfred just stepping through them. When he caught sight of me, he offered, "Master, I'm afraid he's resting at the moment." "If he's sleeping, he can't see me, Alfred, he won't." He interjected, "Master, he is resting, not sleeping. After the trials he has faced, he needs as quiet and peaceful of an atmosphere as possible." Somehow, I kept myself from punching the wall before replying, "Alfred, I just want to see him, just for 1 second, we're leaving for the city soon, if something were to happen while we were gone." He paused before me, reaching out to set a hand on my arm. "He will be here, well rested, upon our return, sir, I assure you." I could have easily knocked Alfred down, barged into the room and had my way. But not in defiance of a Pennyworth promise. Returning to the cave, Cassandra and Tim had already suited up, Tim already sporting his domino mask while hers hung between her shoulder blades. Before they could ask if I had been able to see Bruce, Barbara's tired face came over the main monitor. "What is it?" Robin asked instinctively. "Signal, although nothing is on the scanners, I think Dad just wants to talk to you." Her eyes found me courtesy of the image she was receiving. I nodded, "We'll be there in 20. After she signed off, I turned to walk over to the costume vault, my gut already churning at the thought of which mask I would be wearing that night. Although I had stepped in for Bruce before, it still never made putting the cowl on in his stead any easier. I suited up as Robin and Batgirl proceeded to check the fuel on the mobile. Since Batgirl had left her bike in the city, she had planned on sharing shotgun with Robin. An uncomfortable fit, but it was only 14 miles. Wearing everything but the cowl, I took a moment to look at myself in the waist-high mirror of the vault. After days with no sleep, my eyes had been paired with dark circles and my skin had taken on a slight pallor. I had 2 days' worth of scuff on my jaw and eyes that were borderline bloodshot. Pulling on the mask, all of Bruce Wayne's problems were forgotten so that Batman would be able to focus on his work. With the cowl in place, Batman stared back at me, although his problems were also Grayson's. The ride into Gotham had been silent, with even the police scanners offering little activity. Then again, it was barely 7:30, the night was far from over. Reaching police headquarters, I nearly told Batgirl and Robin to wait in the mobile, but then decided to invite them along. Strength in numbers. Gordon was standing beside the signal, his back to us as we landed soundlessly. A strong breeze passed by, bringing life to our capes, drawing his gaze towards us. Robin perched on the edge of the rooftop. Batgirl standing stoically, arms crossed over her chest. Then the last figure, a man wearing a bat-like cowl and a long jagged cape. "Be Batman?" He stuttered in disbelief, before realizing the man that stood before him wasn't his best friend. "Yes, Commissioner." Among the many skills I had had to perfect under Bruce's tutelage was ventriloquism and voice acting. Although I had a fairly good handle on his growl, it still wasn't perfect, especially to those who knew him well. "You can tell me, you know. I can handle the truth." Gordon looked at me, forcing his gaze to be stern. "I deserve that much, I think." After looking over my shoulder and nodding at Batgirl and Robin, I turned back to the Commissioner. "Your office." He opened his mouth to speak but then reluctantly nodded, about facing to the rooftop's service door. Rather than follow him, I waited for my masked comrades to make their descent back down to the mobile before leaping off of the rooftop myself. With mastered ease from years of practice, I landed on his window ledge, let myself in and situated myself in the far right corner. Gordon walked in 2 minutes later, not even bothering to seek me out in the room before shutting the door and asking, "Is he dead?" I had been caught off guard by his bluntness. In fact, it was at that very moment that I realized I had no idea what I intended to tell him about Bruce's condition given how little I knew. If Leslie was right, if Bruce had lost everything, then the Batman that Gordon knew, the one he had worked alongside for years, was dead. Dark thoughts flooding my mind, I replied quietly, "Yes." He took a moment before turning to face me, his lower lip quivering. Dropping the growl from my voice, I let the lie unfold further. It happened earlier this evening. He went into cardiac arrest. But he was still comatose, so it was painless. He suddenly seemed unsteady on his feet, but as I reached out to him, he stepped back, taking a seat on his desk. "No. Dr. Tompkins believes that in the event he had ever woken up, it would have been a life of vegetation. Not a life for him. Maybe this is better." Tears began slipping over his rough cheeks, and yet the only comfort I could offer him was, "I'm sorry, sir." When his eyes found me, I felt as if he was looking right through the cowl and brave front I was barely maintaining. It was like he was seeing the once youthful vigilante behind the guise, the young boy who did backflips on the edge of the roof while he had talked to my mentor. Finally, he reached up and wiped his face with his hand. "No, son. You're right. Maybe it's better if he..." Despite the fact that I knew Bruce was alive, the realization that the man he once had been no longer was, I felt my eyes grow hot and wet. "So, you're going to come back to Gotham?" "Yes." Gordon was one of the strongest men I knew, and yet seeing him so emotionally weak. Before making my way to the window, I paused in front of him, accepting his hand as it settled on my shoulder. "Good. This city will always need you, Batman." I nodded curtly, "And I'll always be here." Upon returning to the mobile, I was surprised to see that Batgirl and Robin were still waiting for me. Even though the hour was early, there was plenty of ground to cover, especially between the three of us. Still trying to recover from confronting Gordon, I avoided their intent looks of inquiry while I unlocked the hatch. "Well?" Robin finally asked. "Well, what?" I growled before facing him. "What did you tell him?" There was an eerie moment before I replied. "I told him he was dead." "Why'd you do that?" He yelped. I would have smiled, but I was wearing the wrong mask for displaying amusement. I waited for Batgirl to protest as well, but naturally, she remained silent. Robin stepped forward, ready to demand an answer of me, but I beat him to the chase. "We need to accept the fact that the Batman, the Bruce, the whoever you want to call him, is indeed dead. He isn't going to magically remember everything and go back into the life he had. He isn't going to be the same. Ever." I paused, invading his personal space by looming over him. "Do you got that? He's not alive for anyone else. No slip-ups, no goofs, no nothing. Only you two, me, Alfred, Leslie and Barbara can know the truth." After they both nodded, slow with shock, I continued while trying to suppress some of the growl in my voice. "What we need to do now is support him in his recovery, but we also need to make sure that the city is taken care of. We all know how much that meant to him." "Oracle no, tell father?" Batgirl asked softly. "No, she'll keep it to herself. She respects Bruce enough to lie to her father. She's done it before." A beep emitted from the comm link, grabbing our attention. It was followed by Barbara's angry and tear-stricken face. "Damn you, why didn't you call me? Why the hell?" "Calm down. Calm down? He dies and no one tells me and you want me to calm down?" "He's not." I started. She snapped back. "What? He's not dead?" "No, then why the hell did my father just call me in tears?" "I had to, I'm sorry." "What do you mean you had to?" "He's not ever going to be the same, you know that." Barbara cut me off again. "You don't know that. You know what my father said? I killed my best friend. So I hope your master plan is worth it enough to break my father's heart." Click. With Batgirl and Robin still staring up at me, their faces even more shocked than they had been a moment earlier, I told myself I had done the right thing. A brief and harder grief was better than tormenting oneself with wonder and false hopes. What difference would it make if Gordon thought his close ally was dead in more than just spirit? The man behind the mask was a vessel, one that was there to carry out the war on crime no matter what. As he had said, Gotham would always need Batman, and he would always be there. It was much brighter, but there was no one to look at. He left a little while ago, but I didn't know where she was. I wasn't scared though. I couldn't sit up. My head felt like it was 1,000 pounds. But it didn't hurt as much to breathe. I could see a lot of light when I looked towards the window. They were closed. I think. I was confused so easily. I know what I wanted to say, but it comes out all mumbled and confused, but I knew things. Right. She was back. I could understand what they say. At first it was so hard, but it was much easier. How about something to drink? She had a glass of water with a straw. I was thirsty. But how did it come out of the glass? She put the straw in my mouth for me and just stared at me. I breathed into the straw and bubbles formed in the glass. Some specks hit my nose. Drink, Bruce. But how? I blew again and even more splattered. She reached with her other hand and began to tickle my throat. I swallowed in response and a bit of cool water came into my mouth. She stopped tickling my throat and the swallowing ended. Water dribbled out of my mouth and ran down my neck. She wiped the water with the sheet. Try again. The second time, I swallowed on my own. The water actually came up easier and went down my throat in a few seconds. A few sips and I was exhausted. I spat the straw out. That better? She asked. I tried to smile, but it only half worked. Half of my face felt as if it wasn't even there. Maybe it wasn't. I hope not. I was about to try to talk again when there was a loud banging noise. She looked away from me and got up after touching my arm. She'd be back. I hoped I hadn't seen Bruce in over 24 hours. As the time neared 8 in the morning, I had lost all regard for Leslie and Alfred's orders to stay away. Having been up all morning after Batman's victorious return to Gotham, I was on my last nerve. After leaving GCPD, we had scattered throughout the city, making our presence well known to all levels of criminals. Although we had scoured the entire city, I still felt as if we hadn't accomplished anything. Despite the terrorized looks as I jumped down on fleeing thugs. With Tim no doubt trying to function at his first class of the day, I was alone in the cave with no one to talk me out of it. After telling Jim Gordon that Bruce was dead, I needed to remind myself that he was still breathing. I was unable to get the concept out of my head. Bruce was dead. It was heartbreaking that the man I considered to be my father was gone. Finally changing out of the rest of the suit, I washed up and put on a pair of dark blue sweatpants and a long-sleeved t-shirt. Donning the clothes, they were a bit too big for me and I had to forcibly swallow upon realizing they were Bruce's. Trekking upstairs, I pressed my ear to the door, listening to Leslie and Alfred's muted conversation. Footsteps began to approach the door, and I quickly sought refuge in the sitting room across the hall. I heard Bruce's door open and close before Alfred's distinct footfalls traveled down the hall and out of range. My plan had been to force my way into the room, even if it was only to catch a glimpse of him slightly propped up in bed. Exiting the sitting room, I quietly crossed the plush carpet and knocked on the right-hand door. Leslie answered moments later. Did you get lost, Alfred? When she looked at me she gasped, You can't. I have to, I'm sorry. I just want to see him. Is he asleep? No, he's awake. Please. Don't do this. As much as I loved Leslie, I loved him more. With my weight being twice hers, I shoved the door open and walked in. Each one of the blackout drapes had been pulled back, letting in the bright May sun. The only sound in the room, aside from Leslie's protests, were the blips and beeps of monitoring devices that were stationed on the near side of the bed. My eyes instantly found their way the reason for those bleeps as Bruce laid in bed, propped up by 3 pillows. The last time I had seen him, he had been wrought with sheer terror upon waking from his 72-hour coma. As I approached, he looked at me and simply moved his lips. Bruce, I whispered, fighting the quivering in my lip by biting it. He stared at me for a moment and then mimicked the behavior, slowly and deliberately. For the first time in far too long, I felt a real smile on my face. Careful as to not bother him, I sat on the edge of the bed and admitted, I know. Bad habit. You don't have to remind me. He stopped chewing on his lip and stared up at me, blinking. His head twisted to find Leslie before he picked up his right hand and let it fall back down. Even though I knew the answer, I asked the painful question, Do you know who I am? He scrunched my eyes, blinked and then pushed his head back with a soft. Leslie had stepped up behind me but made no further attempt to stop me. I'm your son, he chewed on his lip again. Yeah, he opened his mouth and mumbled, duh. That's me. I'm going to get yelled at for being here but, I had to. I glanced back at Leslie to see her arms crossed over her chest, with one hand covering her mouth, eyes glassy. I looked back to Bruce and smiled again, then again. I'm always getting into trouble, learned it from you, Bruce. He jerked his head to the right and then opened his mouth, Rue. SSSS's. Not sure how he would react, I reached out and set my end on his left arm. That's right, Bruce. I pointed to myself, I then pointed to him, Bruce. When he looked away, blinking rapidly, I took his left hand and extended his pointer finger. Directing it to me, I repeated, he glanced up at me when I turned the finger to point at himself, Bruce. After doing the same 3 times in a row, I pointed his hand to me and looked down at him. He took a deep breath, and then said, Duh. My smile couldn't have been any bigger as I made him point to himself, right, now you. Duh. No, I pointed to myself, duh. Right, now you. Bruce. Rue SSS. Upon seeing the looks on our faces, Bruce smirked, nodded slightly and then crossed his right arm over his stomach. Right. I laughed softly before letting go of his hand. On your own, now. His hand fell limply to the bed. Before I reached out again, he fought to pick it up, although he was unable to point. He aimed his hand at me and mumbled, duh. Letting the hand drop, he pushed his head back and finished, Rue SSS. I felt Leslie's hand settle on my shoulder before I replied, see. Now you know who I am. When Alfred had come down to the cave just after 7 in the evening, I expected him to yell at for barging into Bruce's room that morning. While we had been warming up on the training bay, he had caught me up on what had happened while I had been sleeping through classes all day. My calculus teacher had even taken me aside, asking if I was all right given that I was never one to slack in his class. I lied, of course, and told him I had stayed up all night working on my U.S. history report on Wounded Knee. After skirting out of school, I had raced to Wayne Manor on my bike, worried that hadn't so much as texted me throughout the day. I had been surprised to find him in the kitchen with Alfred, eating what appeared to be a spicy, vegetable and chicken sauce over penne. Lunch for me had consisted of a ham sandwich, 2 Snickers bars and a half-liter of water. As always, Alfred stepped in to save the day, offering me a fairly good portion of the dish. Had patted the stool next to him, hop on up. Once Alfred had tidied things to his satisfaction, he excused himself. It was then had wiped his mouth, so I talked to him. I had almost replied with a mouthful but knew Alfred would race back into his room if I had. Who, Gordon? No, Bruce. Dropping my fork on the counter, I looked to him. What, I mean, how? Kept his eyes straight ahead. Alfred had stepped out of the room this morning, and I made a dash for it. Leslie tried to stop me but it was so surreal, seeing him just stare up at me without any idea who I was. Taking a moment, I had asked, you said you talked to him, how? It was funny, some of it he seemed to understand. Leslie says that she and Alfred have been talking to him as if everything was normal. He picked up his fork and waited to resume eating until I had as well. She seems to think that his comprehension is far better than she had anticipated. He's just having a hard time putting it to use, to communicate. When I was first with him, I got it through to him what my name was as well as his. Whoa, how long were you with him? All day? He had shaken his head. No, he slept most of the day, but any time he woke up, Alfred let me back in, after promising not to get him all riled up. Riled up? I made him laugh, but since his chest hurts still it upset him, but still, seeing him laugh, damn, Tim, I don't think there are words to describe it. Scary, I had kept to myself. After cleaning up our dishes, had lead the way upstairs, hoping for me to get a chance to see him before we started down to the cave. Unfortunately, Bruce was sleeping, but Leslie and Alfred gave in to the pleads and pouts of Robin former and current. As quietly as possible, we crossed the room and walked to the other side of the bed where Bruce had been laying. Given that I hadn't seen him since he first opened his eyes, he appeared to be much better with a clean jawline and a far more natural look to his face. Something about people being comatose took a little bit of the life from them, leaving their faces far too still and far too pale. After a few minutes, had set a hand on my shoulder before whispering into my ear, "He'll be up by the time we get back, we better get going." Nodding, I had looked once more to Bruce's face before returning to the corridor. As we sparred and got in a pretty good workout, I kept thinking back to how my father had been changed by his near-death experience. Having been nearly killed in Haiti, he had returned to Gotham without his active and adventurous spirit. Even after he had regained the use of his legs with physical therapy, he was never quite the same man he had once been. Given what Bruce was facing, I wondering how different he would become. Alfred clearing his throat had not only stopped our ruthless attempt at pinning one another on the mats, but had brought my morbid thinking to a halt. "Master? A word, if you please." Releasing the hold he had on my neck and left arm, sighed, "Oh, here it comes." After grabbing a towel to wipe my face with, I followed him to the edge of the mats where Alfred was standing. He looked over the both of us, his face showing each sleepless hour had been enduring over the last few days under the fluorescent lights. "Sir, I must ask a considerable favor of you." Sighed, "I know, and I'm sorry, Al, but I AHD to see him, I AHD too." "On the contrary, Master, I am most grateful to see your determination has proved worthwhile. Master Bruce seemed very delighted to spend time with you today. However, this favor is to inform someone of Master Bruce's alleged condition. That he's dead? I asked. Quite. Alfred's disapproval of S. white lie washed over his face suddenly. Seeing how you have been quite busy over the last few months, you may not be aware that Master Bruce has been involved in a rather serious relationship. I will leave it up to you as to whether you tell her the truth or not, but I would think very carefully before deciding. I have been able to postpone this matter as long as I possible, however, her inquiries have become quite threatening. Looked to me as if to ask who Bruce had been seeing. I shook my head. Seriously, you don't know? Who? Selina, I smirked. What? I thought they were just, you know. Master Richard, Alfred warned, that is highly inappropriate. I'm sorry, I figured after he told her the truth she would have dumped him. Alfred sighed woefully. At any rate, the matter needs to be breached with her, tonight. Watching Alfred return to the stairs, grumbled, You're coming with me. Why? Back up. We silently suited up for the night before heading into the city in the mobile. Batman had contacted Oracle and learned that Batgirl was already in Chelsea knocking skulls. I would have done anything to be there with her in the shady borough rather than on a suicide mission. Batman dropped the growl momentarily before informing her computerized image, Alfred's sending me to Selina's. Barbara's face softened. She's been calling me. I haven't told her anything aside from the fact that he was shot. He nodded curtly, and I half expected him to ask her advice on what to tell Selina. Instead, the growl surfaced once more and he closed with, Get me a list of those hideouts for the Aces High Syndicate, we'll work on that afterwards. Pulling into an alley 3 blocks from Selina's penthouse, I felt my heart rate begin to rise. I wasn't sure what I was more worried about, what Batman was going to tell her or what her reaction was going to be. Needless to say, I saw stitches in my near future. Ascending to the rooftop of one of the neighboring buildings, we jumped across to hers, dropping down on a wrought iron terrace. She had a beautiful ivy plant that cascaded down the outside of her penthouse to the floor of the terrace. I made a note that it would be a good hiding spot if things got hairy. With the French doors open, we passed through silently amidst silk drapes floating in the high-rise breeze. Music played somewhere in the residence, and after scanning the open living room, I found a Bose player on top of a waist-high bookshelf. Although I had first known her only Catwoman, in the last few months she had become Selina to me. She liked caramel-flavored coffee and wouldn't wait for it to cool before drinking it. She seemed to only wear sneakers, stilettos and Bruce's loafers. She was a human, with a contagious laugh and short temper. In the last few days, I had wondered why she hadn't been brought into the equation, but then rationalized that we had no idea what the equation was. She appeared through the open archway leading into what appeared to be a dining room, bare feet thudding on dark, hardwood floors. She was dressed casually, calf-length sweatpants and a fitted green WWF t-shirt. As she walked over, she had her head buried in a towel, vigorously rubbing her long, dark hair. Although muffled, I heard her say, You know, it's one thing to ignore my calls, cancel dinner on Saturday. It's an entirely different matter to do so with rumors racing around about you getting your thick skull blown off. I cringed at her words as she paused not 10 feet away, bending over at the waist to shake her hair out, giving it one last tussle. If you think you're getting any love tonight, you better think again, because I'm not. When she stood upright, the wise smirk on her face quickly vanished and in its place was a gaped mouth and look of utter shock. She inhaled quickly before demanding, What are you doing in? Where is he? Selina. Batman stepped forward. No, not Batman. His voice was soft and filled with regret. He couldn't tell her he was. Where is he? She growled, fists clenching around the damp towel. I'm sorry, the rumors are true. He took 3 bullets from Pasquale. He stepped forward again, reaching out to her. Don't you dare touch me. Where the hell is he? Her green eyes were always bright, but they were growing practically luminescent with emotion. Hesitated before pulling back the cowl, showing the same emotion in his own blue eyes. Selina, he's gone. I expected her to attack us in sheer rage or to accuse of lying to her, wanting to see for herself that he was gone. Seeing tears silently slip over her cheeks, I realized she was a stronger person than that. Continued to explain that we had no contingency for how to explain Bruce Wayne's disappearance, but that we all needed to work together in order to protect his identity. As his girlfriend, Selena had a role herself to play and he asked if she would be up to the task. She shook her head before wiping her face with the back of her hand. No, I need some time. Of course, nodded, if you need anything. What call? She snapped, trying to redirect her emotional energy offensively. Selena, he defended, this is difficult for all of us, we have to work together. I'm not sure you got the memo. Boy, I don't need to do anything with anyone for any reason. The tears came pouring suddenly and she spun around. Get the hell out of here. Pulled the cowl back on and nodded to me before retreating to the terrace. I had held my ground, looking at him in disgust before walking over, preparing my grapple gun. What? He demanded. Thinking of the weekend before when I had walked in on Bruce and Selena sharing breakfast in the Nook, both smiling brilliantly, I snapped back, you could have told her the truth. We have to keep it within the family, Robin, he growled at me, taking me by the arm. I shrugged him off before leaping from the railing. Ever stop to think she is part foe the family? As I pulled up the drive to Wayne Manor on the 1st of June, I smiled to see Leslie sitting with Bruce in the expansive side lawn beneath the gigantic willow tree. Driving by, I waved and honked my horn. My smile grew to see Bruce wave back. Simple enough of a task, but mere weeks ago, I had thought it would have been impossible. After parking in front of the garage, I put my service weapon in the glove compartment and locked the car up. I had been working with Vice on some undercover work, so thankfully I was already wearing a pair of worn jeans and a fitted gray shirt. Jogging back over to them, I noticed that they were sitting on large red picnic blanket, the scene completed with a picnic basket and a plastic pitcher of lemonade. In less than 3 weeks, he had regained an impressive number of skills considering he had started with nothing. The first week after he had come out of the coma, I had spent every day with him, doing what I could to help Leslie and Alfred. Although Leslie and I had to regrettably return to work, I spent every minute I wasn't in Bloodhaven or on a Gotham rooftop with him. Leslie came every other day, giving us new activities for Bruce to work on. Although not a rehabilitation specialist herself, she had a number of close associates that were peripherally guiding us, remaining out of the loop as to who the patient was. Where he was jumping milestones mentally and even verbally, his body had yet to catch up. He still suffered from sluggish reaction times, limb weakness and problems controlling his fine motor skills. Given that the brain damage had taken place in the left lobe, his coordination on his right side lagged behind that of his left. As difficult as it was to watch him struggle with such menial tasks, Leslie kept assuring us that he had lots of ground to cover and that we shouldn't expect him to reach such milestones quite yet. And even though the Bruce we once knew was gone, there were occasional glimpses into his past. His stubbornness when he didn't want help, the little lip twitch of a smirk, and even the penchant he had for ignoring Alfred when he was being pushy. Most likely they were simple coincidences, but it still made things seem a little bit brighter. Look who's here, Bruce, Leslie said as she pointed at me. He lifted his eyes to me and a smile fell upon his lips. He loved to smile. After kissing Leslie's cheek, I knelt beside Bruce, patting his shoulder. Hey, she working you too hard? No, just shapes. He looked at the brightly colored wooden shapes that laid on the blanket. Only 3 weeks after his mind was erased, he was in kindergarten. I picked up an orange circle. Let's see how you were with a pop quiz. He frowned in deep thought, then said, Cir Clee. Very good, Leslie commented before she asked, and the color? He showed no sign of hesitation, or age. I nodded and returned the block to the blanket. How much longer do you need him for? A few more minutes. Why? I replied, I have a bit of a surprise for him, for dinner. Figured he needed to get washed up and change. Oh, you're more than welcome to stay and see for yourself. Shaking her head, Leslie explained, I only could wrangle a few hours away from the clinic. I have to be back in an hour. Surprise. Bruce looked back and forth between us, intrigued. Although he was fairly good at comprehending what was being said around him, he still needed to focus in order to join the conversation. I nodded at him. That's right, only after you're done with Leslie. Bruce looked to her, smiling until she smirked and agreed. All right, one more block and he's all yours. She selected a blue rectangle. What is the color and shape? Bruce's brow contorted and then looked at me. Purple, square. Shaking her head, Leslie replied, Nope, try again. Green. No, that was the star. She picked up the green block and showed him it next to the rectangle. See, it's different, they aren't the same. The star has points, this one doesn't. Bruce started breathing heavier, his eyes shifting between Leslie and I. After looking down at the shape, he asked, "I different? Square?" I butted in. "See, this is the square." I picked up the block. "This isn't the same as the one Leslie has. Hers is longer. So it's not a square." I gave him both of the blocks for him to look at. The square in his right hand almost fell, but I caught it for him, putting it back into his hand before helping him grip it. He looked down at both of the shapes and remained silent. "Bruce," Leslie asked, "what's the color?" "It, green." "You're close. But we already did green." He looked at the green star. He nodded at each shape, mouthing words of color and shape. Whenever he was flustered over something he didn't understand, he seemed to either work himself into a fret or simply shut down. Thankfully, he had gone the later route before replying. "Blue rectangle." "Blue rectangle, very good." Leslie took the shapes from him. "Great job. Now, you can go with." As she began to pick up the remaining blocks laid out on the blanket, Bruce repeated, "Blue rectangle." I replied, "Yep, you got it right. Blue flower?" "Where? Where did you see a blue flower?" I asked, trying to induce conversation. "Ta ble. Fell Ed over. Here at the house?" I asked Leslie. She shook her head, "Not that I know of." "Where was the table, Bruce?" "Fell Ed over. Walk head on. Blue flower." He looked up at us with hope that we understood him. "Fell Ed over, man." Occasionally, he would ramble what appeared to be meaningless words. Leslie surmised that he was having some memory sparks in the back of his mind that initiated the speech. It actually was a hopeful sign that he has retained his memories in suspended animation and that they simply needed to be brought back to life. "Hun. Have to ask Alfred about Hat 1. I paused. "Why don't we get you inside out of the sun for a bit, then we can get ready for the surprise." He nodded to himself and mumbled once more, "Blue." I brought over Bruce's wheelchair and then braked the wheels. He was doing well with physical activity and rehabilitation, working in the pool every morning with me and then in the afternoon in the gym with either myself, Alfred or Leslie. The weight training regimen he was used to had been cut by more than half so that he could focus on the task rather than the effort. The imbalance he suffered had made walking on his own difficult. Using parallel walking bars, he did very well, but when relying on a walker he fumbled. Letting him grip the chair, I helped him in, being sure he was making an effort to push with his legs. Once he was situated, I helped Leslie fold the blanket, setting it on the picnic basket before handing it to Bruce. "Think you can carry that in?" "Yeah." Leslie followed us in, excusing herself to wash up, leaving us alone in the kitchen. Dinner was to be a fairly big ordeal judging from the guest list and the ingredients Alfred had organized about the kitchen counters. "Surprise?" "Not yet, the wait will be worth it. Trust me, Bruce." "Okay." Carrot v. Carrot, after coming inside, helped me to the den where Tim was watching TV. When we entered the room, he looked up. "Barbara called." I smiled. Barbara was nice, she came up almost every day, spending it with me. Everyone was nice. Always helping me. "Say, Bruce, why don't you hang out in here? I'll go call Barbara back." "Okay," I said, looking at him and then to the TV. Nothing good on. Tim smirked as he picked up the remote. I put my hands on the wheels and pushed forward so I was closer to him. "Want help?" he asked. "I'm okay." "You got it," he smirked. He had a book in his lap and a pen and notebook next to him on the couch. I had lots of books and markers and paper in the study. I could write 6 letters of the alphabet, but I could say them all, well, most of them. "Homework." Tim sighed. "Yeah, physics. Phys, ISS." He repeated it for me, physics. About how fast or slow things go, how far, hot and cold and up and down. I nodded but didn't understand why he needed to read about things being hot and cold. Returned, putting a hand on my shoulder before saying, "Barbara will be here in a half hour, I'm going to take him upstairs, can you help Alfred out?" I already tried, he kicked me out. "Well, maybe he'll change his mind when he hears they're on the way." Leaned over so I could see him. "We better get you washed up." "Dirty?" I asked. "My clothes weren't that bad. It's a special dinner, Bruce, you have to dress up a bit." "Surprise." "I can't tell you what it is." He took the handles of the wheelchair and turned me around before pushing me into the hall. "Then it won't be a surprise." I smiled. "Okay." We took the elevator up to my bedroom. He let me press the button. I could use the elevator myself, but I couldn't get out of it fast enough before the doors closed. Once in my room, he helped me sit on the bed before he disappeared into my closet. "Well, what do you want to wear? Pajamas? No, it's not bedtime yet. How about blue? And a tie? And black slacks?" He emerged with an arm full of clothes, holding them up so they looked they were on a real person. "Très sois, monsieur." I curled my brow and he grinned at me. "We'll have that talk someday." As I started to remove my t-shirt, donned one of the shirts he had found in the closet. It was a bit big for him, but he said we had to dress up and he only had a t-shirt. Then went into the bathroom and found a washcloth and a brush while I started to pull off my shirt. Since my one arm was still weak, I got the job about half done before calling out his name. "Almost." He sighed as he came over to help me. He finished pulling it off for me and walked away to throw it in the hamper. It was then I looked down at my chest, searching for scars. I did it every time I changed or when had me in the pool. Since I couldn't remember, I made up stories as to how I got them. "What is it, Bruce?" asked as he began to untie my sneakers. "Holes." They were, but now they are all better. I touched one that was redder than the others, just under my last rib. "How, holes? How you got them?" After I nodded, he continued, "Long story. Maybe tomorrow. Lots of store-wise. Yeah, we'll get to them. All right, lay back so I can get this grass-stained mess off of you." I reclined slowly and watched as removed my jeans. He then put my feet into the clean slacks and pulled them up to my knees. "Lean forward, you can stand for this." I did and then supported myself by keeping my hands on his shoulders as I stood. He pulled them the rest of the way up, zipped them before helping me sit back down. I forgot a belt. I didn't like belts, but since I had lost weight after the accident, I needed to wear one almost every day. Alfred said he would fatten me back up. While I sat, looped the belt around me but didn't buckle it. He then grabbed the little white shirt on the bed. He rolled it up before saying, "Arms out." I sat there, my eyes transfixed on the window. A car was pulling up and I pointed to it. Followed my gaze. "She must have sped. We better hurry. Come on, arms out." I complied and watched as he slipped the shirt through my arms and pulled it down over my head. Before putting on the long-sleeved shirt, he took the washcloth, wiping my face and hands. He finally put the last shirt on, tucking it in before clasping the belt. "Lots of clothes. Must have been a big surprise." "Willer," he ran a brush over my hair. He asked, "Tie or no tie?" My stomach growled and I answered, "Hungry, carrot v carrot." That morning, I had barged into Barbara Gordon's apartment in the clock tower, my life spinning out of control. With 3 little words, she had put it back on its axis. "Selena, he's alive." The day after had appeared on my terrace wearing the batsuit. I packed my bags, booked a flight to Rome and got the hell out of Gotham. I had wanted no part in pretending Bruce was alive when he wasn't. I had wanted nothing to do with the city if he was no longer in it. The first 3 days in Italy, I had balanced my time between crying, breaking things and thinking of returning to my former life as a world-class thief. But with no one to come after me, the last few months with Bruce had nearly made me forget that I had essentially given up my criminal career for intermittent vigilantism. I had told myself that it had been the thrill of the fight that had lured me, but deep down I had wondered if Batman had hypnotized me, drawing me to his side of breaking the law. When I accused him of as much, he had smirked. "If that was feasible, Arkham would be empty. And you'd be bored to tears." "Precisely," he had replied before kissing me. We had finally figured things out between us, finding a balance between chaos and normalcy. Whenever we went through more than a bottle of wine, our casual conversations turned serious and he had been quick to divert it back to safe waters. I had no intentions of marrying him, and vice versa. We weren't a normal couple, so there had been no reason to act like one. And then, just like that, he was gone. In the midst of my extravagant pity party for one, I had taken ill. Despite my fit form, my back ached when I had finally forced myself to go out and tour the streets. Headaches came from nowhere as I dodged early summer tourists. And then vicious stomach cramps and nausea had finally forced me to seek medical attention. The results had me flying back to Gotham on the first ticket available. Arriving a little after 6 that morning, riddled with jet lag and worry, I bypassed my penthouse and went directly to the clock tower. I had become friends of sorts with Barbara over the last few months but hadn't said a word to her since I had found out Bruce had died. Pounding on her door at 6:30 on the morning of June 1st, she should have whipped open the door and told me to eat kitty litter. Instead, she had invited me in, concern washing over her tired face. Although she had led me into the den, I had no intention of sitting. After all, it would have been difficult to deliver earth-shattering news while reclining. A little more than 12 hours later, I sat in an overstuffed leather chair in the informal den of Wayne Manor, just as if the last 3 weeks hadn't even happened. As if Bruce hadn't been shot, that hadn't lied to me, that I wasn't 7 weeks pregnant. Upon telling Barbara that morning, I had explained, I'm the least maternal person in the world, but I can't. If this is the only link I have left to him, I don't have a choice, but I can't do this alone. I can't. Insert Barbara's tearful confession, Selena, he's alive. She had spent the next hour catching me up on the truth they had been keeping from everyone. Their public cover was that Bruce Wayne had gone salivating around the world, looking for purpose in his life. His yacht, being manned by a well-paid-off boat captain and look-alike Bruce, was last seen in Maui. I could have cared less about the doings of the faux Bruce Wayne, but rather of the real one. Well, it's about time. Tim's voice brought me back from my reverie. I looked up to see standing in the doorway, wearing a smile along with jeans and a slate blue long-sleeved shirt. He found me and nodded curtly before announcing, Bruce wanted to make his own grand entrance. Stubborn old man Al stepped forward and I spotted the edge of a wheelchair that had caught him just under his calves. We should make you get a license to drive that thing. He moved out of the doorway and a moment later the entire wheelchair entered the room. Bruce smirked up it and then proceeded to push the wheels in order to approach the rest of us. He was dressed for the occasion, although his frame had thinned, making the tailored clothing hang loose. Barbara had said that physically he was in perfect health, but my eyes had a hard time leaving the small round scar on his forehead. Tim rose to check on Alfred in the kitchen, leaving Cassandra sitting on the couch with Barbara. Rather than take a seat, approached me, and when I got to my feet, he offered another nod and a hand on my elbow. Good to see you. After I had settled down at the clock tower that morning, I had caught him up to date with the latest family development. He had been speechless, as was expected, but when he did find his voice, he had apologized for lying to me. You too. Guiding me over, knelt before Bruce. Hey, you remember the surprise? Watched as Bruce nodded slightly, smirking before echoing, surprise. He looked from to me, the smirk fading. This is your surprise. I knelt directly in front of Bruce, not surprised when his eyes never left my face. Hi, Bruce. I'm Selena. I used to be. Green eyes, he whispered. I smiled brightly, his voice cutting into me like a knife. Yes, I have green eyes. He paused then said, green. OVALS. He's learning his shapes and colors this week. Selena, forgive him, said suddenly. It's okay. What color are your eyes? I pointed to him. He blinked and said softly, blue. I nodded. You, icy. No, I'm not cold, are you? Shaking his head, he repeated himself, icy. Meow. That stole my breath away, as well as everyone else's. Icy, meow. I looked up as rose to his feet. Does he mean? I redirected my gaze to Bruce. Do you mean Isis? He smirked before saying, meow. As swore under his breath, I asked, did you tell him about me? No, how could he? Stumbled over his words. He has what Leslie thinks are memory flashes. Something comes to mind and he just says it. Bruce reached out with his left hand and touched my face. Icy meow. I had expected to attend dinner at Wayne Manor, to see Bruce's body devoid of his mind. Seeing him with a smirk on his face, his eyes bright with life and his warm fingers on my cheek, it was hard to believe that he wasn't in there. Seeing how painful it was for me to watch Selena talking with Bruce, I could have only imagined what it was like for her. The last time I had seen them together had been on accident. I had taken Dad out for dinner in Midtown a little over a month ago for no reason other than just to spend time with him. Although we often shared brunches and lunches, it had been a rare treat to spend the night out on the town. Dropping his name, I had been able to reserve a table at George's, one of the premier restaurants in Gotham where entrees started at over $40. Thankfully the prices weren't listed on the menus or else Dad would have jumped from his seat and left in search of a diner. On our way out, I had heard a familiar laugh amidst the crowded tables. Glancing back, I smiled to see Bruce and Selena were at one of the more secluded tables on the elevated floor. She was wearing a gorgeous dress, a purple halter coming from around the back of her neck and then looping down to a low, loose neckline. She had been leaning over, whispering something into Bruce's ear. As my father had stopped to wait for me, I had smiled to see him lean in to kiss her cheek while she bit his ear. When they had first gotten together, had called it a groovy kind of love. Immature, he had been spot on. "Shall we?" asked. When I looked up at him in confusion, he continued, "Dinner hath been served." Once we were in the dining room, I waited until had set Bruce up at the head of the table before taking a place next to him. Where Bruce remained in his wheelchair, I opted to move out of mine and into the dining room chair. Left to take his seat next to me, and I reached over to help Bruce put a napkin on his lap. He was doing okay with feeding himself as long as he was able to scoop it with a spoon. Light years from where he had been we had all started. "Do anything fun today?" I asked him. It had been the first day I hadn't spent with him since he had first been shot. Bruce shrugged his left shoulder as he lifted a hand to touch the water glass. "Thirsty?" He nodded. "No, straw." Had overheard him and said, "Knew I forgot something, hang on a second, Bruce." While we waited, I encouraged him to answer my initial question, doing my best not to meet Selena's sad gaze as she watched from across the table. "Picnic," he finally answered, "Leslie, for picnic." "Good day for it. Looks like you got some sun." I touched his slightly reddened cheek. "I don't think I was outside for more than 10 minutes today." Bruce then replied, "Come for picnic." Nodding, I accepted. "Sure, I would love to. Can Selena come?" Bruce finally looked away from his water and smiled at Selena. "Yes, picnic, green." Returned and dropped a white straw into the water glass before raising it up to Bruce's face. When Bruce tried to take the glass away, said, "No, just take a sip." "No, won't hold." Bruce, come on, pushed interfering left hand away. "Just a quick sip, when you drink it down more than you can hold it." "Hold." Bruce tried once more. After getting shut down, he dropped his hand and looked at his lap. "No." It was then I realized he was trying to show off, that he could hold his own glass. "Just help him hold it," I interjected. "Bruce, just let help you hold it." His eyes focused on his water glass, acting as if he hadn't heard me. When went to take Bruce's left hand, he jerked it away, shaking his head, "Not their tea." As the music of dinnerware clanged and chimed, I kept my eye on Bruce, ready to help if needed. Where we had twice backed potatoes, asparagus in olive oil and lamb chops, Bruce had mashed potatoes, pureed vegetables and lamb. Midway through dinner, Bruce dropped his napkin, and after Selena had retrieved it and replaced it for him, Bruce had thanked her softly as a blush crept over him. No matter how much he had changed, his affection for her seemed to have surpassed biological laws. When he had been talking with her in the den, saying words that were not random mutterings but specific memories, dancing just out of his reach. If simply seeing the face of a person had brought that much out of him, I could only wonder what the weeks and months to come would bring. With dinner coming to a close, conversation rose once more, drifting to the third shift. When Bruce had started picking up vocabulary, we had all agreed that we would not speak of our alter egos by name in front of him. Bruce was generally tired by the time dinner came around and found it difficult to keep up with the conversation. Given that he had barely uttered more than a dozen words through dinner, I surmised that he was ready for bed. While Tim and debated between whether or not a nameless foe was hiding in Chelsea, I barely heard Bruce say quietly, "Flashlight." "What, Bruce?" asked, looking over at him. Bruce's good arm slowly rose and pointed to the window, pointing out what flashlight meant. "The bat signal. The big flashlight," I said and nodded to the window. He glanced over his shoulder and jerked slightly at the searing white light, stood and wiped his mouth. "Well, I better get some paperwork done tonight." Cassandra stood silently, but Tim rose while saying, "Yeah, I've got quite a bit of homework still. Lots to do." Bruce kept staring at the sky, his face lost in confusion. When he looked back to see that everyone had left save for myself and Selena, he started breathing heavily, straining his neck to search the room after stealing the croissant from S plate. I tapped Bruce's shoulder. "Here, last one." He shook his head and returned his gaze to the sky, setting the baked good on his plate anyway. My eyes rose to find Selena staring at him, her eyes welling with tears. She was the strongest woman I had ever met, The only raw emotion I had seen her express had been rage and sheer joy. For the second time in 12 hours, I was seeing her cry. When I said her name, she shook her head, wiping her eyes dry with the corner of her napkin. It's okay, it's so surreal. Before I could reply, Bruce unlocked the wheelchair and pushed himself away, slowly turning around and heading for the door. Bruce? He paused, looking down at his lap before saying, work. Home. Lots do. What do you have to do? You want help? I offered. Bruce finally looked up, smiling at Selina before adding, no, hold, surprise. When we were alone, Selina feigned composure after taking a deep breath. Do you think he's still in there? Judging by tonight, I wouldn't doubt it. I should have told you about the memory flashes. I don't know why I didn't. I began apologizing, but she held her hand up. Selina shook her head. No, it's okay. Like he said, it was a surprise for both of us. Can you see the fireworks from up here? Bruce asked suddenly. Through a miraculous twist of fate, I had managed to get the 4th of July off in order to spend it with Bruce. After a hearty lunch of Cobb salad pitas, we had gone outside to sit on the terrace to read. The baking sun, chirping of merry birds and sheer exhaustion had left me dozing off while laying in a chaise. In the last 2 weeks, I had only been up to the manor every other day, my hectic lifestyle over the last few months starting to creep into my time with Bruce. Thankfully, where I had been lagging, Barbara and Selina had stepped up. I had been Batman for barely a season. How the hell Bruce had ever managed to balance both his lives for so many years was beyond me. While I had been sleeping, Bruce had walked off of the terrace and taken a seat in the grass, book in hand. As I opened my eyes at his question, it had taken a minute to find him. Regaining his basic life skills, he had started to vie for independence, something neither Alfred nor myself were ready to grant him. He was walking, reading, dressing himself. He was a 6-foot-tall third grader. After yawning and wiping my face of accumulated sweat, I replied, sure, you want to watch them? He pondered for a moment as he looked to the bright blue sky. Yeah. Barbara said they were great in the city. But you could see them even better from up here. Sitting up, I thought back to countless Independence Days at Wayne Manor. The best ones had included sitting out on the rooftop with Bruce and watching Gotham come alive with color. Yeah, there's a great view from the top of the house. The roof? I nodded, getting to my feet before crossing the stone floor and joining him in the grass, but I think Alfred wanted to set up some chairs on the front terrace, little bit safer than the roof. Yeah, Bruce smirked before opening and closing the hardcover book in his hands. I had been reading the BFG by Roald Dahl with him off and on throughout the day, but when we had gone outside, he said he wanted to try to read by himself. At first, it had been difficult to be with him, given how much he had changed. The body was the same, tall, broad and strong, but his entire demeanor had been altered. After weeks had passed, we all had grown accustomed to seeing a smile on his face or seeing him curled up on the couch watching a movie. He wasn't that man who raised or trained me. He was a new person. And as much as I hated to admit it, I almost liked him better this way. Almost? He asked as he reclined back onto the grass. Yes, Bruce? He paused and suddenly sat up, a feat that was near impossible a month ago. Do you think, maybe, Selina can come up? I had erred in telling Selina that Bruce had died, and any time I saw her with Bruce I was reminded of it. Since she had been told the truth, she had been nothing but a wealth of support and love for him, not much different from before he had been shot. She had taken a big interest in not only his mental occupational rehabilitation but his physical as well. His first steps had been under her watch, when he had gotten up to get her a blanket while they watched a movie in the den. Selina had said it was the most romantic thing he had ever done for her. Aside from siring her child, it was still a challenge to comprehend that Bruce and Selina had separated just as their relationship was taking a major turn. As curious as I was to know what would have happened had Bruce not been gunned down, I knew that asking her and her fluctuating hormones would have been lethal. Knowing Bruce, he would have done the right thing, helped her raise the child to whatever extent Selina wanted. At 3 months pregnant, Bruce realistically had 6 months to get back to a reasonable adult level of mind in order to welcome his son or daughter to the world. Leslie and Alfred had decided, along with Selina, that it was best not to tell him yet, seeing how he was still unable to comprehend that complicated of a situation. That, and I knew that neither one of us were ready to talk about where babies came from. Seeing him smile, face red from sitting out in the sun, I was thankful that he was enjoying himself. The last 2 weeks had been upsetting for him, his sleep plagued with confusing dreams and nightmares, rooted in memories he didn't know. The dreams had started when he finally got his answer about who his parents had been. Being able to follow movies, television and stories, Bruce had come to realize that every person had a mother and a father. One night, while Alfred had tucked him in, Bruce had asked if Alfred was his father. Upon getting the vague explanation that Alfred had helped raise Bruce but was in fact not his father, Bruce had been disheartened. The next day, Alfred, Leslie and I had carefully explained the minimal details regarding his parents. Thankfully, he hadn't cried or yelled, but had just absorbed all of the sadness within him and nodded. One of his traits that he hadn't lost. I sat up and glanced at my watch, 12 to 3, well, you ready to go in? He looked at me with his brow furrowed, I haven't read my book yet. I sighed and stood, you have all night. The fireworks won't start until after dusk anyway. Bruce nodded and rose as well, holding his book tightly to his thigh with his good arm. I folded the blanket and then led the way into the house in silence. I let him go first into the service entrance of the kitchen and shut the door behind us. A small silver pot steamed on the stove and I could smell melting chocolate. Of course, I smiled, 4th of July. Alfred's brownies. I suddenly thought back once more to those hot July evenings, watching the lights explode in the sky with a plate full of warm brownies and a tall glass of root beer, 1 scoop of vanilla ice cream for each. Nights where Bruce was unable to join the festivities, I had to settle for sitting on the terrace with Alfred. Needless to say, I had spent more nights on the terrace as opposed to the roof. Since I had yet to work out and catch up on some investigatory reading on Gotham's newest drug ring, I had to spend the remainder of the afternoon in the cave. Making sure Bruce was set up in the den with books, paper and pencils and a TV remote, I told him I had some errands to run. Can I come? No. Sorry. But I'll call Selina to ask her up, and I know Barbara and Cass planned on dropping by, maybe Tim, too. He nodded before sitting on the couch, still holding the book. And we'll get in another chapter when I get back, okay? He reluctantly replied, okay. I met with Alfred as I headed to the study, updating him on where Bruce was in the great house. He set a hand on my shoulder before saying, thank you, sir, your time means the world to him. Another change in him that I loved. Carat v carat, wow. It was unbelievable. All of the colors literally exploding from out of nowhere. Red, gold, white and blue. Loud ones and quiet ones. A few that whistled and crackled. Big spheres and small stars. It was great, except wasn't there. While Alfred and I had sat on the terrace, had yet to return from his errands, nor had he called to say where he was. Alfred suggested that he had been called away to work but would most likely do his best to be back before I went to bed. I hated it when he had to work, but it was his responsibility. Hopefully, I had never left him behind to work. I don't think I could look at myself in the mirror if I had. If that hadn't been enough, Barbara and Cassandra had stayed in the city, Tim was at a friend's house and Selina was ill. It was nice to be with Alfred, but it was also nice to see everyone else. They should do them more often, I said as I stood from my chair. S voice suddenly replied, they do. Wait until New Year's Eve. Not only do they have fireworks, they let you drink champagne and kiss people you don't know. I glanced around to see him standing in the open doorway, suddenly wondering how long he had been standing there. I smiled a bit, what about people you know? Alfred gasped and laughed. I hadn't meant for it to be funny, but sometimes things came out and those around me laughed. Stepped forward and selected a brownie from the serving tray. Sorry I missed it, managed to sneak away for a little bit but I do have to go back to work. With one last look skyward, we all moved towards the house. I had to wash up and change for bed but seeing Hal was there, I hoped that I was able to stay up for a bit longer. My hopes were crushed when instead of heading downstairs, Alfred had announced he was going to ready my bath. Looking to, he nodded, it's all right, I have tomorrow off too. Maybe we can go for a ride on the golf cart. As much fun as going around the property in the cart was, I wasn't ready for the night to be over. I'm not tired, I stated. Put a hand gently on my elbow, turning me to my room, come on, you get cleaned up and change, then we can read that chapter. I bathed in record time, not even washing my hair. Before last week, someone had always helped me wash but I was ready to do it by myself. I had even showered on my own a few times. Barely dry, I donned fresh pajamas and walked into my bedroom to find sitting on the bed, his lower lip trembling. He wiped at his eyes and looked away before asking, "You brush your teeth?" "No. You okay?" He grinned up at me before pointing back to the bathroom. "I will be when your teeth are brushed." We read 2 chapters, although he mostly read and only had me read aloud some of the shorter sentences. He promised to come home after work so that we would be able to have breakfast before spending the entire day together. "No work, I promise." As left, Alfred stepped into the room carrying my medicine and water. After he handed me 2 blue pills, Aleve he called them, I took them with the glass of water in his other hand. After giving him the empty glass, he pulled the covers up over me while I asked, "Alfred, do you think is sad?" "Sir?" he asked, looking confused. "Sad, about me. Like, he doesn't like how I am, now." "That he is embarrassed of you, sir?" he offered. When I nodded, he explained, "Certainly not. Master is very proud of your accomplishments thus far, as we all are." "So he likes me?" "He loves you, sir." I nodded and smiled. "I love him, too." I paused. "He's good, not a kid, but a big kid." "That he is, sir. You raised him very well." I sighed. Rarely did anyone talk about my past in front of me, but I enjoyed it when they did since I wanted to learn more about myself. Like telling me something important as they had about my parents. I ached for them, after learning the truth, but they had died so long ago, and I would never remember them. Only in my dreams were they alive, but I wasn't even sure when my dreams were real or not. Maybe my mind was just playing with me, tricking me, torturing me. But there have been better things about who I used to be that they had told me, about being my son, adopted, but still my son. About how Tim had grown up next door to me and Barbara was such a close friend of mine. Also, about how Alfred had raised me, so now he was like my father. And perhaps most of all, how Selena and I were very close friends. She visited often and we played games or went for walks when it was nice in the evenings, and if not, we watched movies together. Sometimes when she was watching the screen, I liked to watch her. Her smile, her eyes. Walked in on us once and laughed. Selena had thrown a pillow at him. "My savior. Carrot v carrot, Dad, it's just me. Just calling to let you know that I'm going to be out and about until tomorrow afternoon or so. Maybe we can catch an early dinner. My treat. Anyway, call my cell phone if you need me. Love you, bye." The answering machine played Barbara's voice. I had been feeding off of her energy, my own unusually sapped in the last 2 months. Then again, it wasn't unusual to mourn the loss of your best friend, I supposed. If it hadn't been for Barbara, I would have had my own cozy room in between the Riddler and Poison Ivy. It had been difficult, knowing the man I called forward at night was his replacement, even if it was his son. I had hoped there would be a funeral of some sort, a private one at least, in order to pay my respects. Lord knew how many colleagues and acquaintances he had that never got to say goodbye. But not a word had been mentioned about him after that horrible May night in my office. In the 2 months since he had taken up the mantle, the city had once more fallen under his control, the rampage in the days following the Pasquale incident diluted through sheer force. Pressing delete on the answering machine, I sat on my sofa. 10th of July, a Saturday. The message had been left when I had been out grabbing breakfast at the bakery down the block. Maybe that Grayson boy had swept my innocent daughter off of her feet once more. Wouldn't have been the first time, and deep down I sure hoped it wouldn't be the last. For years that had been in and out of a relationship, whenever I had seen them together, they had showed nothing but true love for one another. Despite his tragic past, Grayson had managed to grow into a sensible, charismatic, good-natured young man. And if it couldn't have gotten any better, he was a well-respected young officer on the Bloodhaven police force. My status had allowed me to make unofficial inquiries into his efforts, and I had heard nothing but stellar reports. He had been raised by a good man, a man I hadn't seen all summer. The last I had heard was he was still touring the globe in his yacht, a trek he had started in the beginning of June. Ware had all of his guardian's best traits. Thankfully, he hadn't taken on the worst ones. I had a fairly good relationship with Wayne, but that was in spite of his womanizing, alcoholic and money-flaunting ways. Sure, some of it was to maintain the standard in the public's perceptions of how a handsome billionaire was supposed to act, but it didn't make it any easier to accept. I stood suddenly, speaking aloud to no one, have to water her plants. Grabbing my keys, I raced out to the car, happy to have something to do on my day off and, more specifically, anything to keep me from ending back at headquarters. Even though it was 8 in the morning, traffic was heavy in Tri-Corner, making the 3-mile drive nearly 20 minutes. I cut off a woman in a minivan for a parking spot right in front of the clock tower. In my older years, I had lost the ability to distinguish the importance of things. At home, I had a sink full of dishes, a shaggy lawn and a leaky showerhead. But as God is my witness, I wasn't about to rest before making sure my barbarous plants were adequately watered. The elevator ride took 2 silent minutes, giving me ample time to prepare my keys for her apartment door. Barbara had 3 locks on the door, and once it was opened you had 15 seconds to enter a 10-digit number on the security panel within. Typical for a single woman living in a very busy part of the city. Typical for any person who had been gunned down by the Joker. Her apartment was dark and silent but still yielded a warm, welcoming feel. After a quick tour of the open rooms, I found a glass in the kitchen and filled it with tepid water. With potted and hanging plants in the den, guest bathroom and her bedroom tended to, I found the second hand on my watch had barely made 3 complete rotations. The kitchen was spotless, garbage and recyclables already taken out, not even a single bit of dust on the hardwood floors. Washer and dryer were both empty, as was the dishwasher. Complete opposite of my humble abode. I sighed to myself as I found myself with nothing to do or fret over. Accepting defeat, I began making my way to the door, reaching the atrium just as the phone rang. Backtracking to the den, I nearly picked it up before realizing it wasn't my place to do so. She was an adult. I had to respect her privacy. So I simply listened as the answering machine picked up in a nondescript computerized voice, "Please leave a message after the tone." Beep. I wasn't sure who I had expected to be calling her at that hour, but the voice that left the message stopped me in my tracks. "Barbara, it's just me. Must have missed you. Alfred has breakfast ready, and I convinced him to have it in the pool room, so should be fun. See you soon." Could it be that my Barbara was no longer involved with the Grayson boy, but rather the man that had raised him? I had seen Barbara interact with Bruce socially a number of times and had seen no inclination of anything more than general amicability. If she had left to spend the day with him, that meant he was done flaunting his wealth about the globe. Back in Gotham, back to his old ways. I had a sudden urge to take my morning out of the city and into Bristol, my mind reaching back to when I had first visited Wayne Manor. My first wife, heavy with my firstborn son, had accompanied me to have a brief questioning with Bruce in his lavish estate. I would have rather had him taken into the station to work him over a butt, possibly being the Batman, but my supervisors had forbid it. He had been drunk, wearing only a loosely tied robe, and spent most of the interview fighting off the advances of a stunning young woman who he didn't even know the name of. "I don't want to waste your time, Mr. Wayne. My time is worthless, Lieutenant. Just ask Alfred." He had been right all those years ago. Even today he wasn't worthy of my Barbara. As I tended to my afternoon chores and duties, I listened as laughter faintly echoed the dark halls of the manor. Only in snatches of history had similar sounds been present. Master Bruce as a toddler and well into his early years, running about in his father's hat or hiding in the draperies of his mother's dressing room. As he had aged, his boldness had been insurmountable, taking his antics to the outdoors by climbing the ancient trees on the property. His mother always fretting about such behavior, but his father would always laugh. Then there had been no more laughter, no more joy, nothing. Master's childhood had brought a much-needed lightness into the old house, but the years had passed far too quickly before the young boy had become a young man. Master Jason's brief time with us had yielded far more shouts than laughs. After his passing, I had feared that Master Bruce would never find joy in life, condemning himself as a failure, with comparable self-hatred and punishment. Thankfully, Master Bruce and the rest of us had been proven wrong by the inquisitive and self-assured boy next door. Master Timothy had brought a new life to the manor, just before his mentor had to endure a number of life-altering changes. Bane, the plague, the quake, enemies of different shapes and sizes. Despite the tragedies endured, there had been a noticeable change in Master Bruce, perhaps the very change that had led him to seek the company of Ms. Selina once more. Although it had been many, many years since Master Bruce had uttered a laugh, he had seemed content in the joy of others. Even in spite of the reason behind it, hearing his audible joy after such a long time had been shocking to others, but a pleasantry to my old ears. The joy of a father's knowing his son was happy. A son, not by having my blood course his veins, but for having his blood stained upon my fingers more than I would have cared for. Al, I was taking inventory of the pantry, a weekly task performed every Saturday in order to prepare for Sunday morning shopping. Without looking up from my growing grocery list, I had acknowledged, "Yes, master." "Bruce is asleep in the den, I'm going to run downstairs for a bit." A bit. A time appraisal I had heard hundreds of times before. Although the gallant return of the Batman had brought a necessary level of order to the city's chaotic nightlife, his vigilantism was not without challenge. For the last 2 weeks they had endured no progress in their search for the self-proclaimed new ruler of the underworld, one Anton Bauer. He had absorbed the territory left behind by Henri Pasquale, doubling his own drug trafficking reach. Although unlike Pasquale, he had been able to cover his tracks, offering nothing to the police or caped crusaders. Master was growing restless on the lack of progress on his first major case as the Batman, forcing me to remind him incessantly that he would bring those that dare challenge him to justice. "Very good, sir, and Ms. Barbara?" Also conked out. Guess neither one of them were in the last crusade mood. When I finally turned to face him, I was pleased to see a smirk on his face. "I'll be back up for dinner, Al." Alone, I completed my task, placing the list in my jacket pocket as it hung from the coat rack near the service entrance. It was still far too early to start dinner preparations, incidentally leaving me a moment to myself. After preparing myself a fresh cup of tea, I resigned to the kitchen nook that overlooked the side yard. Its level, perfectly manicured lawn had become a haven of sorts for Master Bruce, from reading outdoors to staring up at starlit skies. "Alfred?" a soft voice asked. I looked towards the doorway to see Ms. Barbara smiling, a faint fog of slumber still in her eyes. She made her way to table and continued, "He's moving along so quickly." I nodded. "Indeed he is. When he is in the library, hunched over his books at the desk, it is rather difficult to see that anything has changed at all." "I know." She bit her lip and I looked away, my own emotions churning in silence. When she made no further attempt to speak, I inquired, "Miss Gordon, is something amiss?" Taking a moment to push back a strand of loose auburn hair, she answered, "Alfred, he asked me why I was in a wheelchair." My silence urged her on. I told him someone had hurt me, someone bad. I obviously didn't give him the whole story, but the look in his eyes, I had expected him to be sad or worried. "Alfred," he looked angry. He wanted to know if that person was caught, and even though I told him he was so, Bruce. "It seems logical enough, Ms. Barbara, he can no longer contain emotions he once held beneath the surface, especially those concerning the ones he cares for." I paused to adjust the teacup on its saucer. I was tempted to inform her of my bedtime chat with Master Bruce the night of July 4th, hearing such affection in his voice and words for his eldest. Something I had also been waiting to hear for some time. Before she could reply, Master Bruce appeared at the door, his shirt twisted about his form and the back of his head displayed hair that stood nearly vertical. He rubbed his left eye with the back of his hand. When I glanced down at his feet, I smiled to find that one of his socks had been absent. I chuckled despite myself, for it had been 30-odd years since I had seen him in such disarray. Ms. Barbara joined in, laughing softly before adding, "Good morning, sleepyhead. Like the hair, very styling." He offered a broad smile, running hands through his graying hair, making it even more chaotic. "Better?" "Couldn't get any worse," Ms. Barbara had countered, reaching scorce the table to squeeze my hand. The night had been brisk as my breath rose in soft puffy clouds. I had dashed out of the theater, slashing invisible foes with my invisible sword. I had heard my father's soft chuckle as he guided my mother out the door. As I had spun around and fought with the imaginary, corrupt soldiers, I had caught a glimpse of them. My father had wrapped his arm around my mother's back, offering warmth against the chilly eve. She had turned her head and whispered something in his ear, something that had made them both smile. Continuing my one-man war on crime, my mother had said, "What a magnificent Zorro you make." "I know. I'm the best swashbuckler in Gotham." I had then proceeded to stab the A, imaging my foes falling to the ground. My mother had laughed, "That you are, Brucky. But even great swordsmen need to put their hats and coats on." I had sighed and trudged back to where they had been standing. With as much pouting as I had been able to muster, I had put my coat and hat on. Then, before it was even buttoned all of the way, I had leapt forward and slashed at more invisible fiends. Before my mother had been able to stop me, my father had laughed out loud. "Let him be, Maddie. He's busy saving the day." As we left the front of the theater, I had been ushered back to walk closer with them as we walked to the nearby parking lot. Usually, we had gone to the nicer places in the theater district, but since this was an older movie, it was only playing at the Monarch. I hadn't admitted as much, but I had liked it better. Their popcorn was hot and fresh and twice as buttery than the fancier places. My father had promised a while ago that when it played, that he would take me. He had dressed as Zorro a few years ago at a Halloween party, and after seeing the movie, it was amazing how much he now looked like Diego de la Vega. I was about to say so when they started talking about the hospital with my mother. Rather than walk beside my father, I had lagged a step behind. When they did this at home, I would find Alfred. He would always talk to me. I couldn't wait to tell him all about Zorro. Maybe he could help me make the cave in the backyard into my lair, and I would have been able to. "Gimme your wallet." A shivering voice suddenly rang out. I had looked up to see a dark-clothed man standing with a gun beyond my father's clenched fist. My eyes had widened in fear as my father refused to do so. I had wanted to tell him to do it so he wouldn't get hurt when the man had glanced at my mother, who was shaking in fear. "Fine, the lady's pearls'll do." My father had lunged at the man and a thundercrack had shot through the night air. I had watched as my father's body jerked and fell to the cold pavement. His arm had twitched a few times and then he lay very still. I had then looked up to see the man with the gun, hooking his wrist around my mother's pearl necklace. She had screamed as he pressed the gun to her throat. Another thundercrack. The pearls had flown everywhere, scattering over the dirty pavement, bouncing. My mother had fallen beside my father, convulsing as blood spurted from the cavern in her neck. I had tried to look away, but I hadn't been able to. My eyes locked on the pool of dark red liquid surrounded my parents. The man had vanished, his footsteps echoing nearly as loud as the pearls dancing. Then there had been silence. "No," I had whispered. "I was supposed to protect you." My mother's tremors had ceased and she had finally grown still. My father hadn't moved since he had fallen. I had touched his arm. No response. I had pushed him a little bit. Nothing. "No," my voice had quivered. I then had set my hand on my mother's pained face. "No," I had said more firmly, "no." As I had knelt between them, their blood had soaked through my pants, my nice slacks. Closing my eyes, I had screamed, "No, Bruce, it's okay." I opened them to find sitting over me, the overhead lights on, showing him to be wearing a blue t-shirt and flannel pants. Even in my panicked state, I thought it was off that he looked like he had just taken a shower, hair wet, face a little red and jaw shaved. "It was just a bad dream, Bruce, it's okay now. Here, have some water," he said as he reached for the glass on the bedside table. It wasn't a dream, it was real." I took a deep breath before continuing. "It really happened. I had been having weird dreams and nightmares for weeks, but it had been the first one that had felt as if I had actually been there. When I covered my face with my hands instead of taking the water, set the glass back down and then set a hand on my shoulder, "Bruce, I know it seems like it, but it's just a dream, it can't hurt you." They were real, I managed before tears came flowing from my eyes, just as they had in the dream. Puzzled, he asked, "Who was real, Bruce?" "My parents. They were real." Sighed, rubbing my shoulder, "Yes, they were real, but your dreams aren't." I shook his head violently, taking my hands off of my face to push his arm off of me. "No, you're wrong. I was there. I know it." Taking a breath, he then questioned, "What did you see, Bruce?" In the 2 minutes since I had been woken up, the dream's impact had remained strong, but the images hadn't. Doing my best to focus, I started saying things that came to mind. They were there. Laughing. Swords. I had a sword, bad guys everywhere. But they couldn't hurt me, 'cause I was Zorro. And then the thunder. They were bleeding. They were bleeding all over, and the pearls. When I looked up at him, his mouth was open in shock, eyes wide in surprise. "That's what you saw?" he finally managed. I nodded, but when he asked if I had seen anything else, I couldn't say what. Rising to his feet, straightened my blankets, turning on the bedside lamp before saying, "No wonder you were scared. It's still pretty late. You should try and get Beak to sleep." "Can you stay?" He nodded, "Of course." As he walked over to turn the overhead lights off, I looked to the alarm clock, surprised to see it was 4:30 in the morning. Why would he shower so early in the morning? After I laid back down, sat on the edge of the bed once more, seemingly staring anywhere but at me. Did I remember? He nodded, a little bit. Wish I could remember all of my dream. Can I remember more, you think? Paused, looking down at his lap before replying, maybe. Carrot v carrot. I am going to kill him, Barbara. I smiled and put the phone receiver between my jaw and shoulder. Hey, it's not all his fault. Selena growled in response, yes it is. If he hadn't been so seductive and charming and hadn't always worn those damn skin-tight suits, when he gets better, I'm going to kill him. At 4 months pregnant, Selena was far from the happiest mother to be. Her first trimester had been horrendous, with near constant nausea, cramping and heartburn. The independent woman that she was, Selena had suffered in somewhat silence, ascertaining that she was more than capable of handling this latest hurdle in her life on her own. Although we were together frequently when at the manor with Bruce, she had taken to calling me socially at all hours of the night. I was able to discern her mood by what hour she called. Anything after midnight and I was going to be getting an entertaining earful. On the 15th of August, she had spiced things up by calling me at noon, although rather than vent about her delicate condition, she had 2 topics on her agenda: maternity clothes shopping and a date with Bruce Wayne. I look like damned Moby. I sighed, adjusting the phone once more as my fingers fought with inserting a new oral device into S. cowl. Selena, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but you have 5 months to go. Don't remind me, she growled, I'll be too mob, s. The worst part is that quack of an obstetrician want to me gain more weight. You are eating for 2, I snickered. I'm eating for 3, hell, 4. They measured the baby at my ultrasound Tuesday morning, already 6 inches and 6.5 ounces, going to come out full grown. Selena swore under her breath, before explaining she had spilt milk all over the counter. Happens to the best of us, I offered before asking, so when are you going clothes shopping? I've been indoors all morning, could use dome fresh air. Well, I think I can hold out one more day. Wait, you didn't go up to Bristol? No, ending up taking the day off. Guess Bruce had a rough night. The humor in her voice vanished, concern taking its place. Is he okay? Had called me a little after 8 to tell me he would be at the manor for the day. When I had asked what was up, he had explained that Bruce had a pretty bad nightmare. Not unusual, but then he had explained that it had sounded like Bruce had remembered the night of his parents' murders. This is big, Babs. This could be the start of it, you know. I had told him to not get his hopes up and he had sighed. I know, I can't help it. My glass is always full. Thinking of Selena's glass being empty, I finally replied, he had a bad nightmare, had trouble getting back to sleep, just couldn't leave him after that. Such a good boy. She commented, trying to put lightness back into her tone. That he is. Well, I'll clear my schedule for tomorrow, if you need emotional support shopping for jeans with elastic waistbands. She laughed sadly. What would I do without you? What would any of you do without me? I hung up after wishing her luck on her date. It had taken a considerable amount of begging and pleading to convince everyone Bruce was ready for a trip into the city. He had a perfect grasp on proper etiquette and his mild immaturity fit Bruce Wayne the fop perfectly. That, and with Selena at his side, no harm would possibly come to him as she would be able to cover if anyone approached him. It was actually a nice setup, late afternoon meal at a wonderful little place on the harbor that socialites seem to avoid given its reasonably priced, delicious food. I only knew of it because it was one of Dad's favorite places. He had often jested, why eat bounty literally fresh from the sea for half the price for seafood 2 days old in Midtown? After seeking approval, had apparently informed Bruce of the plan last night, and I wondered if the excitement of the trip to the city had sparked the nightmare. Before the shooting, on the rare nights I had spent at the manor, I had been awoken from a dead sleep hearing cries and shouts in the dark. It was never a topic of discussion the next morning, and the one time I had brought it up to Alfred, he had been quick to settle any burning embers of inquiry. Although where Bruce had once suffered his burden alone, he now looked for comfort after night terrors. Thinking of the manor, I found myself dialing the number. Pleased to hear greet, what kind of pizza you want a? Caller ID, it takes all the fun out of impromptu phone calls. I beg to differ, I think it makes it all the more fun. What's up? Not much, wondering how things were going up there. Cleared his throat, not bad, trying to pick out an outfit for tonight. Bruce doesn't want to wear a tie. I heard Bruce's faint voice, it's too hot out. Formal casual, that's fine, I offered. All right, Conceded, no tie, but you're still not driving. Since when has he been driving? I asked while picturing him tearing up the priceless greens of the manor's grounds. Bruce said something, and when asked what it had been, he laughed. Well, it was our little secret. We can trust Barbara, though. She won't rat us out to Alfred. For the entire 20-minute drive through the Bristol countryside and onto the main freeway, Master Bruce fidgeted. A nervous habit. A very disturbing nervous habit. Not so much in the ordinary man, but seeing such anxiety in a being that once had complete control over every inch of his body. Every glance I took in the rear-view mirror, he had obtained a different position in the seat, rolled up and unrolled his sleeves, or had been at work on the control panel's buttons. So for the duration of drive, we listened to nearly a dozen radio stations at countless volume levels and from many speaker combinations. Upon entering the city limits, his gaze fixed more often to the buildings and vehicles surrounding him, and the fidgeting lessened, but did not cease. He had been to the city a handful of times since May, namely to visit Ms. Barbara at her residence and to have bi-weekly appointments with Leslie. Each time we passed over the St. James Parkway towards the first monstrous bridge leading into the city, he had been mesmerized by the skyline. To think he used to trapeze about on their rooftops. This was to be his first public visit, and although it was in a secluded part of town, I still found myself wrought with worry. He was going to be under the good care of Ms. Selina, but I would have much preferred they simply dine at her penthouse. Master had finally pointed out that keeping him locked up would only hinder his ability to completely redevelop his social skills, keeping him stunted. With a sigh, I had agreed. Whilst preparing leave for the late afternoon date, Master Tim had arrived at the manor to utilize the training bay of the cave. Rather than head directly to the study, Master Tim had opted to spend time with his former mentor, giving him tips on how to have a good date, despite it being summer vacation. Mazer Tim had found little time to spend at the manor during the days, and the one instance I had inquired about it, a disheartened look had come over him. It's hard, Al, he had sighed. I can't even look at him in the face. I had offered words of encouragement. It has been difficult for all of us, young sir, but given how little time you have spent in this family, alongside Miss Cassandra, I would imagine it to be insurmountably more difficult. Nothing to be ashamed of. Walking into the den to see Master Tim recite compliments to say to Ms. Selina had put a much-needed smile on my face. He, as well as Master and Ms. Cassandra, had fought the never-ending string of criminals throughout the summer months. Although at first it had been a hurdle to carry on in Master Bruce's stead, they had finally learned through trial and error how to manage on their own. I couldn't help but think that the skills he had taught them, the independent thinking and adaptability he had forced on them, had allowed them to proceed as quickly as they had. He had raised them well, and how would he fare with a child of his very own, from infancy rather than entering his life through tragedy? The subject had been broached a number of times, and since I was the one who spent the most time with my charge, I felt as if he was prepared to learn the truth. It was far better that he be told and have matters explained than to have him discover it on his own and have unanswered questions. Lord knew he had enough mysteries floating in his mind. He certainly had no need for another. As we neared Ms. Kyle's apartment, his behavior returned and in fact worsened as he began to toy with the electronic window controls. Sir, I warned while pulling into the parking area out front. Sorry, Alfred. Little nervous. Do you have any? I handed a mint back to him as I parked the car. Thanks. Should I take the small bouquet of flowers was then passed back to my anxious master. Thanks, again. He opened the door and was about to shut it when he popped his head back in with his mouth open to speak. I replied before he could even ask, your hair is fine, sir. He smiled and left. I was stepping out of the elevator into the lobby when he walked in. Even for him, he looked good in tailored midnight blue slacks and blazer, slate blue shirt with the top 2 buttons undone. I smiled when I noticed the small collection of roses he tried to hide behind his back as he searched the near-empty atrium. Before calling his attention, I observed him from a distance. When we had started dating a little over a year ago, his 6'1" frame bore over 200 pounds of a perfect muscular system. His hair had been jet black and he had always appeared in complete control of his facial expressions, whether it had been as the dim-witted playboy or the emotionally plagued Batman. But that had been a year ago. He still had the chiseled features, but he had trimmed up a bit. Had said the day before that they had weighed him and he was just pushing 180. His hair was no longer black, but singed with gray, especially at the temples. Dr. Tompkins had said it was common for victims of major trauma, whether physical or emotional, to suffer from rapid aging. His facial muscles were relaxed, and often folded into a full smile. The scar above his left eye had faded some, but it was still noticeable if you knew to look for it. A permanent reminder, but the man still looked damn fine. After seeing his smile wane slightly, I made my way over and greeted him with a smile and a hand on his elbow. "Hey stranger." His eyes lit up. "Hi." After handing me the flowers, he added, "These are for you, from our garden." Alfred said it would mean more than buying them. "Did you pick them?" In place of answering, he held up his left hand, showing a few tiny pricks in them. I couldn't help but laugh, stepping up onto my toes to kiss his cheek. "Thank you, Bruce." He stiffened slightly and then looked to the door to hide his blush. "Shall we?" "Let's," I answered, holding the flowers in my right arm while looping my left with his arm. Passing through the revolving doors, the rush of air wafted his cologne over me, sending my memories reeling. Myself barely 30 years old, flirting with a young and bashful Bruce Wayne. My claws tracing the outlines of the Batman's chest muscles. Waking up in the morning, my face in the crook of his neck. Sniffing his sweaters after watching the news the morning after the shooting. "Selina, you all right?" I looked up to see Bruce holding the car door open for me. I nodded and stepped in. He paused before shutting the door and then got in on the other side. I bit my lip and looked to see Alfred smiling in the mirror. "Hi, Alfred. Ms. Selina, what a pleasant surprise." As we pulled out onto the avenue, I snuck my hand over to Bruce's knee and gripped that hand that rested there. He looked up and smiled before squeezing back. Same old charm. Same old Bruce. The ride to the other side of the city took nearly 20 minutes, most of which I spent chatting Bruce up about what he had been up to lately. Where he would have once brushed off my questions, he readily answered them animatedly. He even leaned over to whisper into my ear, teaching me how to drive, but Alfred doesn't know. I wanted to say that Alfred knew everything, but I settled for congratulating him with another kiss on the cheek. 3 minutes early for our reservation, the host ushered us directly to a table that was ready and waiting, including 2 candlesticks freshly lit. Bruce pulled my chair out for me and gently pushed me in before taking his seat across from me. Instinct urged me to kick off my shoe and trace my toes up and down his shin, but I somehow managed to keep my feet planted on the ground. As the host listed off the house recommendations for the amuse-bouche, entrees and paired wines, I looked to Bruce before answering, "Hun." "Oh, this is all you," he grinned. "Be that way, we'll have the spinach, frisée and pear salad, and we'll share the seafood tortellini. Ah yes, and to drink, might I recommend a nice Sangiovese?" "No thank you." I set a hand on my stomach and the host nodded with a knowing smile. After ordering raspberry tea for the both of us, the gentleman departed. Looking to Bruce, I found his gaze was directly staring at my abdomen. As I moved my hand across the table to reach for his, I asked, "Bruce?" "Yeah," he said quietly. "Are you okay?" He looked up and met my eyes before turning them away, scanning the busy restaurant. "What's wrong?" I asked, finally latching onto his hand. His breathing had hitched a bit as he finally looked back to me. "Are you with child?" I nodded, gently brushing my thumb over his quaking hand. "Yes, 4 months." His heart visibly sank deep into his gut. Oh, does that upset you?" He shrugged, then let go of me to play with his napkin. "Well, yeah. Alfred said that to have a baby you have to be married or be with someone for a long, long time, and I like you, Selina. I like you a lot, and if you're then you already have someone." I cut him off. "Love, Bruce. If you like someone a lot, you love them." He nodded. "Well, then, I love you. I love you." Emotions choked me momentarily, but I replied as soon as I could, "I love you, too, Bruce. You are very special to me." He shook his head. "But what about the father? You can't love more than one person like that, can you?" I shook my head. "No, you can love people differently. Like how you love as a son and Barbara as a friend. I love the father of my child with all of my heart, though." He looked confused. "Then how can you love me, too, Selina? I don't understand." I rose from my chair next to his and kissed his cheek softly. Before moving my face from his, I whispered in his ear something that would surely earn an ass reaming from Leslie and Alfred. "I love only you because you are the father of my child, Bruce. Come on, Jim." "My treat." Sitting at my desk, I looked up to see the face of Renee Montoya with a slight upward curve in her lips. My gaze then returned to a small framed photo of Barbara that was just visible behind a mountain of special crimes files. The picture was over a decade old, but it had captured the very essence of my daughter. Braided shoulder-length hair, face full of freckles, bright white smile. She wasn't more than 16 at the time I had taken it. Same time she donned the cowl. I had spent a majority of the summer digging into a theory that I had ignored for far too long. The deeper I had looked into her youth, the more plausible her being Batgirl had become. Every sprained ankle from gymnastics, or bruised body from a bad karate lesson, had by chance matched up with front-page articles declaring the success of the Caped Crusaders. Batman, Robin, Batgirl. Barbara had always been interested in justice, far beyond what any normal policeman's daughter should have been. She had always inquired about my dealings with Batman and his allies, her soft smiles making sense after so many years. Hell, the way she and Robin had first met, on the rooftop, the way they had stared in shock at one another. I once was blind, but now I see. Batgirl had disappeared from the city's nightlife shortly before the Joker had shot Barbara and taken me hostage, rather than after. Confusing, but at the time I had far more important things to worry about. She had returned during the no man's land that had seized Gotham, but obviously a much smaller and younger girl. One who never uttered a word where the original had always been forthcoming. I had also found out something inconsequential in regards to my daughter being the former Batgirl. Bruce Wayne was back in town, still on a sabbatical from his duties at Wayne Enterprises but making attempts at private visits in town. Dinner in secluded restaurants, walking in Robinson Park and more importantly, making long visits to my daughter's apartment in the clock tower. Since I had overheard the message he had left at her apartment, I had been keeping tabs on him, hoping to find him courting another woman rather than my daughter. On the 4th of July, I had dropped by her place unannounced just before dusk. The look of surprise on her face suggested she had forgotten I had been a detective once. "Dad, how did you know that?" Barbara had smirked at that before replying, "We're not dating, Dad. He's just going through a rough time. Needs someone to talk to, someone who knows him outside of being a billionaire playboy." Her smirk had faded before she had answered, "Knows, he understands." "I bet he does," I had sighed while trying to accept the fact that she had passed on her strained relationship with the ward of the man she wasn't dating. We had left it at that, never mentioning it again. When Montoya proposed lunch once more, I nodded as I stood and grabbed my blazer. It was in the 80s but I needed something to cover the holsters as I wouldn't want to ruin anyone's lunch. Montoya, who had just closed a special crimes case involving the estranged Cornelius Stirk with the aid of Gotham's newest Caped Crusader, was in a mood to celebrate. I, on the other hand, needed a distraction from my constantly brewing thoughts about Barbara being courted by a man 10 years her senior. She paused while I donned my coat. "Fresh ocean air will do you good, Jim." "So would a chastity belt on my Barb," I muttered. She turned. "What, Jim?" "Nothing. Should we invite Bullock?" "He's interrogating that head of the car theft ring, said to bring him something back." Upon arriving at the restaurant, making good time in the early afternoon traffic, we had made it 10 minutes before our reservation. Although the place was far from packed, the bar was, and we were asked to enjoy drinks out on the front patio. Unlike the interior, the wrought iron tables were barren. It had seemed odd considering the nice breeze that was battling the humid air. As the hostess had escorted us to one of the smaller tables, she stated that the patio was reserved for a dinner party at 5. We chatted about Montoya's case in between a waitress arriving to take our drink orders and then delivering them 5 minutes later. After 25 minutes and 2 complimentary drinks each, I noticed a couple step through the front doors and down the steps and towards a tree-shaded sitting area. The woman appeared to be pregnant, early on, maybe second trimester at best. She was still very attractive in a tailored pantsuit, makeup accenting a stunning face surrounded by dark, wavy hair. Walking in front of the patio, I noticed she had taken his hand into hers, just another happy couple enjoying an afternoon together. I couldn't help but to think back to my first wife when she had been carrying my firstborn son. As much as we had loved one another, my decision to move us to Gotham had driven a wedge between us and we spent most of those long 9 months fighting. As they passed, I looked up while taking a sip of my tea, just in time to see his face. My chest was soaked as I dumped the tea all over myself. Bruce Wayne, holding hands with a pregnant woman? Was it his child? Or was she just a friend? Did he get married abroad and no one knew? I studied his face as Montoya exclaimed, "What happened, Jim, miss your mouth?" "Excuse me." I rose from the table as the happy couple approached a pair of chairs. "I'll be right back." I had lost the ability to breathe. The skin of my face had been burning where her lips had touched me. My ears had been ringing from her words. My chest had closed up and my head had gone light from the lack of oxygen. I had barely felt Selina's arms snake around my shoulders as she pulled me to her. Her breath had landed softly on my neck as she whispered, "Bruce." My mouth had opened slightly but nothing had come out. Father? How could I be a father? I didn't even know how babies were made, let alone for me to do it to Selina. Why hadn't anybody told me? After a moment of silence, her arm had dropped slowly and she had repeated herself, "Bruce, are you okay?" I had cleared my throat. "Selina?" "Yes, Bruce?" My eyes had glanced down at her abdomen and then back to her eyes. What had I even wanted to say? I hadn't been that confused in months. I had needed Alfred, or they would have known what to have said. Another thought had struck my frenzied mind. If I was the father of Selina's baby, were we married? Had they lied to me? As much as I had wanted to, I couldn't ask her, not there. Instead, I had simply mumbled, I don't feel good, I'm sorry. I ruined our dinner." She had sighed as she took my hand into hers. "No, I shouldn't have told you, not like this, Bruce. If you want, I'll call Alfred and we can go home." Home? Was it our home? I had nodded, my words lost once more. Selina had stood upright after kissing my cheek. She had made her way to the waiter's booth where she chatted a bit with the man who had taken our orders. After she had handed him some money, she had retrieved a cell phone from her purse and turned away from me as she spoke into it. When she had returned to our table, she had grabbed my hand once more. "Alfred's on his way. Let's get some fresh air while we wait for him." I had nodded and unsteadily walked beside her out to the main entrance, our hands only separating when I held the door for her. Alfred had said that manners had never been my strong suit, but I couldn't imagine why. I would have done anything for her, especially then. We had walked in front of the patio and headed towards a small sitting area that had wrought iron chairs situated beneath a number of tall, willowy trees. Before taking a seat, I had managed, "Selina." Turning to face me, she had smiled softly while ing her head to the left. "Yes?" Are we married?" She had looked away as I continued, "I mean, I don't have a ring and you don't." "No, we aren't." Her eyes had continued to avoid me. "We were dating before your accident." "Did we want a baby?" Selina had finally looked up at me. "Bruce, I don't know how to answer that." Nodding, I had apologized. "I'm sorry, I'm just really confused." As my words had given way to a nervous laugh, Selina had turned to take a seat and motioned for me to do the same. "Good, that makes two of us." Since I had been looking down at her, I had my back to the restaurant as well as to the gray-haired man that was approaching. I hadn't even seen the man coming. Or his fist. The next second, I was on the pavement with blood seeping from between the fingers pressed to my mouth. As if I hadn't been confused before, the man growled something under his breath as Selina jumped from her seat, yelling at him to back off. He was about to yell back but stopped as he recognized her. "Selina Kyle." She ignored him as she knelt beside me, setting one hand on my shoulder while the other cupped the side of my face. "It's okay, Bruce, let me see." After Selina inspected my split lip, she returned her focus to Gordon. "What in the hell was that for?" He sputtered a bit as a woman in a dark blue pantsuit approached, poised for action. He's dating the both of you." "What?" Selina snapped as she helped me to my feet. I looked up at the man and the woman's confused faces and then looked at my feet. I wanted to be anywhere in the world other than right there. "You and my Barbara," he growled as he pointed at me. She growled in response, defensively stepping in front of me. "He isn't dating Barbara. Where'd you? He's not even, damn you for." Although she hadn't been able to get a complete sentence out, she hesitated as Alfred pulled up. She then looked to me. "Bruce, get in the car." "But what if he?" I started. "I'll take care of this." I glanced up at the man and woman once more. Their confusion had finally matched my own. Reluctantly, I turned and got into the car before Alfred had been able to open the door for me. As he grabbed the handle, he looked at me with concern. "Sir, are you all right?" "Yeah." I touched my lip. "I guess." He nodded, still with a worried look on his face, and then spoke before shutting the door. "Very good, sir." Carrot v. Carrot. Before leaving Master Bruce in the safety of the town car while I joined Ms. Selina, I telephoned Master. He had been in Gotham for a prisoner transfer and had intended on dropping by the manor before returning to Bloodhaven for the evening. Using my rarely used mobile telephone, I dialed and waited impatiently for the duration of 2 rings. He then answered, "Hey, Al, what's up?" "Sir, there has been an incident requiring your attention." "What's happened? Is he all right?" he inquired frantically. "No worse for the wear. He attended an early dinner with Ms. Kyle and, it appears Commissioner Gordon intervened." "What? What are talking about? Never mind. Where are you?" After providing the address, he growled, "I'll be there in 2 minutes." Looking once more to the tinted window where no doubt Master Bruce was intently looking out at the scene before him, I took a breath and began to quickly walk over. Thankfully, those within the restaurant had not noticed whatever had transpired and the voices of the 3 individuals I was approaching had remained civil. Although the tone had certainly not. Ms. Kyle promptly was feverishly growling at a dumbfounded Commissioner Gordon and Detective Montoya. I recognized a number of colorful words and then, assume anything, why in the hell would you think that? It was reassuring to know that she had not lost her innate aggression due to her childbearing-induced hormones. As the police officers looked in my direction, Ms. Selina did as well. I cleared my throat before inquiring, "Ms. Kyle, Master Bruce seems to be all right, and, might one inquire as to how this altercation arose?" Commissioner Gordon cleared his throat. "I overreacted. I thought he was dating my daughter, and when I saw him with Ms. Kyle, I punched him in the face." Ms. Selina finished for him. I nodded. "I see. Then this has been an unfortunate misunderstanding, has it not?" "Unfortunate for him." Ms. Selina glared. Before I could make another attempt to appease the situation, Detective Montoya looked behind me. "You called the cops. We're the—" "No," the commissioner interrupted her, "that's Bloodhaven PD." The patrol car approached, taking the nearest spot. Even though Master had pulled up without lights and sirens, a hostess appeared out the front entrance with a look of fear on her face. After stepped out of the car and donned his hat, he waved and offered a friendly smile. "Just visiting, ma'am." "Oh, the table is ready for the party of 2. Commissioner Gordon nodded. "Give it to someone else." Although she had returned inside the restaurant, there were no doubt a series of prying eyes were within. Nodding the Master, he then proceeded, "Al, why don't you take Bruce to the manor? I'll bring Selina up shortly. Maybe we can have dinner, without an audience." Returning to the car, I took the driver's seat, buckling in as I stared into the rearview mirror. Master Bruce had wiped his face clean, and seemed to be proudly sporting his battle wound as a soft smile was gracing his lips. "Sir?" He looked up at me. "Funny seeing driving a cop car." "That it is, sir, an eventful afternoon, sir." "Eventful, I suppose. I mean, I did become a father." I nodded as I carefully pulled out of the parking lot and onto a one-way street. It wasn't until I had maneuvered 3 traffic lights that his words sank in. After a methodical breath, I asked, "Sir, did you say you became a father?" "Yeah. With Selina." With my mind instantly dragged into the filth of the gutter, I asked, "Where did this event take place?" "At the restaurant. Right there at the table." My eyes nearly leapt from their orbits in shock at picturing Master Bruce and Ms. Kyle, on the table, partaking in inappropriate actions with wary eyes watching. No wonder the commissioner had hit him. "In public, you say you did this?" Master Bruce nodded and touched his sore lip. "Yeah. No one heard us though." I found myself coughing before being able to continue. Sir, did. I'm not quite following you, sir. Please, tell me what happened." He shrugged and looked up at my reflection. "Nothing really, she just did it." "Did what, sir?" "You know, Alfred. Enlighten me, Master Bruce." "She just said that I was the father." I felt an immense weight free itself from my chest. "Words, Alfred Pennyworth, just words, not actions." I smiled slightly. "Well, then, sir, congratulations are in order." His shoulders slouched a fraction. "Alfred?" "Yes, sir?" "What did I do to make her have a baby?" I had given a 12-year-old Master Bruce a similar talk decades ago. It certainly would not happen again. "Well, sir, I will have to put that question up to Master. I'll see to it that he comes to the manor this evening." Carrot v. Carrot. Breaking up a fight between Catwoman and Commissioner Gordon wasn't exactly how I had intended to spend my afternoon. Given my ties to Gotham, I had always seen to it that I was available for any all prisoner transports from Bloodhaven. When Bruce had been framed for the murder of Vesper Fairchild, I had even gone as far as paying off my co-pilot for the night, leaving him at one of Gotham's premier strip clubs so I could visit Bruce in his holding cell. Seeing him in that dark cell, alone and riddled with fury, had once been the worst thing I had ever seen. A lifetime ago, after Alfred had left with Bruce, I looked back to the tense figures before me. All right, what happened? As Selina opened her mouth, Jim stepped forward and explained things from his point of view. I had to fight back a smile, knowing full well that his false assumptions had been well supported from his point of view. Barbara and Bruce had been spending the last 4 months together more often than not. My busy life had prevented from me spending any alone time with her, not even so much as a dinner. Typical jealous man thinking. Okay, I offered as he finished. When Selina went to speak up, I shook my head. Okay, I said. What's done is done. She crossed her arms over her chest and sent me a glare that would have rivaled one of Bruce's. Suppressing a shudder, I proceeded, Jim, if you've got some time, I'd like to talk this over a bit, in private. We all looked to Montoya, who shook her head, fine by me. Jim sighed, hold things down at the fort, I'll be back as soon as I can. Once she had begun walking towards her unmarked, Jim continued, what in the hell is going on, son? I found my hands resting on my hips, my right thumb grazing the butt of my service weapon. As I looked around the parking lot, I replied, little too public, mind going for a drive? If I can get some answers, you can have them all, I smiled back. Selina looked to me, damned if I'm riding in the back. It was a long, painfully tense and silent drive to Bristol, made only longer by commuters making the trek home. Once one navigated the patrol car up the winding drive, I pulled around back and parked behind the garage. We all noticed Bruce sitting out on the rear terrace by himself, staring out at the expansive green of the rear lawn. Selina excused herself, slamming the door shut before walking briskly up the walk and stone steps. I smiled when Bruce looked up at her just before she leaned over and kissed him. Bet you wanted to kill him. What? Jim asked, thinking he was with Barbara and seeing him with Selina. Close to it, son. Altaga, I had taken my hat off after getting in the car at the restaurant, my scalp still tingled. Running a hand through my hair, I proceeded to rub it over my face as well, pretending I could wash away the fatigue. Is it his? The baby? I asked, and when his reflection clarified with a nod, I proceeded, yes. 4 months along now, kind of a surprise for all of us. He sighed before asking, they going to get married? I couldn't help but laugh, knowing that remembering his vows was the last thing Bruce needed to worry about. No, I don't know about that. He's not ready. He better be responsible at least. My smile grew, picturing an infant in Bruce's arms. Oh, I'm sure he'll want to play with it all the time. Play with, damn it, you have more maturity than he does. My amused smile quickly died off. For the moment, yes, he'll get better, though. His reflection in the mirror said it was time for me to stop skirting around the real issue at hand. Letting my voice drop an octave and a half, I explained, I should have never lied to you, that he had died after Pasquale shot him. After he woke up from the coma, he had lost everything. He was infant trapped in a grown man's body. Now, look at him. My eyes left the rear view mirror and found Selina and Bruce walking hand in hand into the house. Leslie had given him so little odds of ever recovering, it just felt like the right thing to do at the time. Like telling you the truth now, it just seems right. Given that the only sound from the backseat was heavy breathing, I continued, I know he never told you who he was, but he had always thought that if you wanted to know, you were more than capable of finding out by yourself. But now, I don't think there's a reason to hide behind a mask. I think you deserve to know. I finally turned in the driver's seat, looking back to see his eyes glassy, no doubt not at my revelation of who Bruce was but the fact that his best friend was still alive. I think, you deserve to be family. As I fell silent, I waited for him to say something, anything. 5 minutes later, his mustache twitched and he asked, Can I see him? I grinned, as long as you keep that right cross to yourself. My mouth hurt, but that wasn't what bothered me. Was sitting in the patrol car with the man who had hit me, and he appeared to me smiling. Every time I gazed in their direction, they were talking, or at least seemed to be talking. Had arrested him. I had expected Alfred to explain what had happened and who the man and woman had been on the ride home, but he barely said a word. He, like Leslie, were uncomfortable with me going into the city, saying I wasn't quite back to my old self yet. But I liked to. No, I loved it. After being cooped up in the manor for so long, it was amazing to be able to walk the streets. Thinking back to the restaurant, I couldn't remember saying or doing anything mean, especially to the man who had hit me. In fact, I couldn't remember even seeing him at all. Perhaps before my accident, I had done something to him, but that didn't seem right. What could I have possibly done? Bruce, let's go inside, get you an ice pack for that lip. I looked up at her and nodded, glancing to S car once more before getting to my feet. It didn't make any sense. Upon arriving home, Alfred had left me on my own to tend to a few things in the house. I expected him to be in the kitchen when Selina and I entered the room but was surprised to see it empty. She patted one of the counter stools before heading to the refrigerator. Taking a seat, I touched my lip gently, feeling the dried blood and swollen tissue. "Got you pretty good, didn't he?" she asked as she retrieved ice cubes, nestling them in a hand towel. "Yeah," I replied quietly, as she pressed the ice pack to my face with her right hand and rested her left on the top of my shoulder, rubbing it gently. I studied her face, confused by seeing her so emotionally upset. Usually, she was always smiling, always happy. If I hadn't overreacted to her telling me I was the father, we would have been enjoying dinner and I wouldn't have been hit in. All my fault. I felt her fingers begin to knead my muscles and found myself tensing instead of relaxing. There were still many moments where I felt nervous around people, especially with lots of physical contact. Usually, when it was with Selina, it was easier to try and relax, but for some reason, I couldn't. She must have sensed it and quickly dropped her hand from my shoulder before removing the ice pack. Even though it had only been a few minutes, it felt much better. As she looked it over, I found myself looking into her eyes. When she stared back, I dropped my line of sight to the marble countertop. "Bruce?" Selina asked suddenly, "You okay for now?" Without looking up at her, I nodded. "Well, I'm going to try and hunt down Alfred. You want to go into the study for a bit?" Another silent nod. Her fingers found my chin, gently raising it to force me to look at her. "Did Alfred tell you who the man is?" When I shook my head, she continued, "It's Barbara's father. Jim. He thought, since you've been spending so much time with Barbara that you were dating. When he saw us together, he thought you were cheating on her. That's why he was angry, that's why he hit you." When I didn't respond, she added, "You didn't do anything wrong, Bruce." "I know, why would he hit me, if he thought that?" Biting her lip, she fought a smile before replying, "Because fathers want to protect their daughters." I responded, "Or sons." She leaned in and kissed my cheek, "Or sons." Entering the manor through the service entrance, I followed through the small foyer, past the kitchen and pantry and into the corridor, all without a word. My mind was racing with questions, but I couldn't find the will or perhaps nerve to ask them aloud. He stopped at a number of doors, pressing his ear to them before moving on to another. When he paused before a large, dark-stained oak door near the rear of the house, he spoke for the first time since we had stepped out of the patrol car, and it had been to himself, of course. Turning to face me, continued, He's probably going to be scared of you, considering he takes things personally, but after we set the record straight, it should be okay." There was an odd look in his tired eyes, an old look, one that had no business being on a young man's face. I nodded slightly before clearing my throat. How is he? I mean, at the restaurant I only saw him walking." Smirked and looked to the door once more. "He's like a teenager. Wants his independence but isn't quite ready for it. He has a pretty solid grasp on things, just not the maturity." "Never figured him to be mature to begin with," I countered. Replied, "True, instead of fighting over him risking his life recklessly, now he wants to stay up past 10. He knocked softly on the door and called out, "Bruce, you in here?" I smiled when a faint reply came from within, "No." Hesitated before opening the door slowly to an ocean of darkness. I had been in that particular room only once before, lost during a Wayne Foundation dinner. I had been quick to realize that it wasn't the bathroom, but rather than instantly return to my search, I had hesitated. The study was as lavish as any billionaire's, but it was the personal items that had caught me off guard. The oil portrait of the late Dr. and Mrs. Wayne above the fireplace, the suit coat and necktie hanging from the back of the desk chair, and day's paper partially folded on the end table between two leather chairs. A glimpse at the man behind the name and lore. Nothing compared to the glimpse I had gotten in the backseat of a BPD patrol car. Stepping in after, I found the study to be nearly as it was all those years ago. Bruce was sitting in one of the leather chairs with his back to us, intently staring down at something in his lap. Without looking up, he spoke, "I want to be alone." "I know, Bruce, but we need to talk about what happened today." "I don't want to." Paused just behind the chair, looking over his shoulder at me as I came to stand behind him. "Life's full of things you don't want to do." He paused as he resumed walking, coming around in front of the chair before kneeling, "But you have to." I stepped up as well, trying to control my breathing as I stopped just behind the chair. In the car, I had wanted nothing but to see him, speak with him, and with the opportunity before me, I was filled with uncertainty. As resumed talking with Bruce, I chanced to look down to see what had him captivated. A photo album. Bruce turned the page, ignoring S words. The pictures were of a young, black-haired boy sitting on the broad shoulders of a tall man with a dark mustache at what appeared to be Robinson Park. Memories he had lost forever. It was difficult to accept that he had no memory of the life he once lived. Not the lives he saved or killers he brought to justice. His allies and enemies. Our friendship. When looked up at me and sighed, Bruce tensed before looking behind him as well. Rather than flinch or show any sign of fear, he simply returned his gaze to the pictures. With my presence known, I managed to walk around, taking a seat in the chair next to him. I nearly smirked upon realizing that he kept looking over at me from the corner of his eyes, thinking he hadn't lost his reliance on peripheral vision. Finding my voice once more, I said, "What I did was wrong. But a father will do anything to protect his children, often acting before thinking. I thought that you." "I don't know what I thought." Bruce smiled slightly. "I don't know what I think half the time, either." He turned the page and I looked over to see the day in the park and given way to Halloween. A boy in a skeleton costume stood in front of a man dressed as Zorro who had his arm around a woman dressed as an Egyptian princess. I squinted and made out feminine cursive. "Brucky's first Halloween ball, age 6. "Bruce, I am so sorry," my voice came out strained and pathetic. He closed the book slowly, gently tracing the edges of the leather binding. "You're right, fathers protect their children," pausing to look up at me, "no matter what." When my eyes caught the look on S' face, I thought to myself, and children protect their fathers, no matter what. Carrot v. Carrot. After Cass kicked me in the side of the head, I recovered, ducked and lunged at her midsection. Fruitless, considering she knew what my move was going to be before I had. Not up to spending the afternoon in the cave by myself, I had made the trek into the city after lying to my father and telling him I was going to a lecture on how to prepare for college. Instead, I had jogged Robinson Park, treated myself to a lime snow cone from a vendor near the playground, and then had proceeded to the clock tower. A nice, friendly spar with the daughter and star pupil of one of the world's greatest assassins. Yeah, something like that. As Cass wiped the training mats with my face for the better part of an hour, I did my best to focus on the physical challenge of it in order to drown out my thoughts. After nearly 4 months, I had reasoned that I should have accepted how things had changed in the family. Was no longer Nightwing, he was Batman, and with that came the expected changes on our nightly routines. No more punch buggy game. No more L train tag in the comm. Link was for business, not "that's what she said" jokes. We had to grow up sometime. I just wasn't ready. Deep down, I had come to realize that it wasn't S' new role that was bothering me. It had been Bruce's. At first, I had been able to go up to the manor and spend time with him, helping with his rehabilitation. For some reason, towards the beginning of July, I found that the thought of being there with him had begun to feel like being with a stranger. As much as I had missed the juvenile antics and I had once shared, I longed for the stern looks and low growls of my former mentor even more. Alfred tried to corral us up each week for dinner, but I had intentionally missed 4 out of the last 7. Seeing the soft smile on Bruce's face and the scar on his forehead nearly brought tears to my eyes. Retreating a step for every one of her vicious jabs, I smirked while preparing to block the impending roundhouse I expected Cass to throw. Naturally, she had realized my assumption and spiced things up with an uppercut, sending me spinning face first into the matted wall. "Can't assume," she sighed. "Ass. You. Me. Yeah, I got it," I replied while rubbing the hot pink flesh of my right cheek. "No, you don't," she countered, crossing her arms over her chest. We had been at it for an hour and she hadn't even broken a sweat. After she appraised my condition, she offered. Take 5. Advil, I joked. Cass's left eyebrow rose in confusion and I shook my head. Never mind. She rolled her eyes, a trait she had notably picked up from living with Barbara, and proceeded to exit the training room and head towards the main apartment. I nabbed a towel off of a shelving unit and wiped myself down before following her. By the time I caught up, she was already in the kitchen, uncapping a liter bottle of spring water. After perusing the refrigerator, I settled for a more manageable half-liter. Before I could ask Cass what she had done that day, aside from kicking my ass, Barbara entered the open archway, shaking her head. What's up? A smile crossed her lips momentarily before she answered. My father saw Bruce and Selena having a late lunch, saw them holding hands. I guess he was under the assumption that he had been dating me since we've been together so much. She finally let a laugh loose, said he walked right over to them and punched Bruce in the face. I looked over to Cass as she said, assume. You, me. What did Selena do? I was quick to ask. She sat back in her chair and crossed her arms. Thankfully she kept her cool. Alfred had been on the way to pick them up, so he took Bruce while she stayed to help sort things over once got there. They called? Barbara continued. He was doing a prisoner transfer, ended up cutting short on his shift to take Selena and my dad up to the manor to talk. Said Selena rode shotgun, made my dad sit in the back. That brought a smile to my lips. On a more serious note, she tried to contain her grin, decided that it would be best for us and for my father if he knew why Bruce didn't recognize him at the restaurant and why he's been with me so much. Cass spoke softly. Truth. As Barbara nodded, I set my water down. Wait, told him the truth? Not all of it. He only told Dad about him and Bruce, but with 2 pieces of the puzzle, he's more than capable of filling in the blanks. I felt insulted and was quick to voice it. How could he do that, without asking us? It's our lives, not just his. Barbara cut me off, her tone severe enough to send a chill down my spine. If anyone deserves to be told the truth, it's my father. He's been fighting this war since before you were born. I advise you not to forget that. When I remained in silent shock, she relaxed and added, I'm sorry, Tim, it's for the best. And besides, he is the closest thing to a best friend that Bruce ever had. It wasn't right for us to lie to him. She said something about being by in a few hours before excusing herself. Alone, I looked to Cass, wondering how she felt about the latest addition to the family. Just as she read my body language, she appeared to be able to read my mind. After emptying her water bottle, she said, It's okay. Commissioner good man. Batman respect him. Trust him, we all should. It was the truth. Batman respected and trusted him. The both of them. Carrot v. Carrot at 10 after 5, the Bloodhaven police car pulled out of the drive of Wayne Manor. Within it was and Gordon, making the trek back to Gotham after spending nearly an hour in the study talking with Bruce. After I had found Alfred tending to duties in the laundry room, I had returned to the study only to find that it was more than occupied. Not wanting to interrupt the male bonding, I opted on retreating to the seclusion of the 3rd floor. More specifically, Bruce's bedroom. Since he had been shot, I had been in the room nearly 24 times, namely only to open the door and look inside for Bruce. Seeing how I had some time to myself, I had allowed myself a quick stroll down memory lane. Breakfast on the terrace, sharing baths in the massive tub, trying to outdo one another in his bed. Given that the past was long over, I had come to realize that I was in a life with the present man. Sometimes, my subconscious forgot about it and had me trying to reconnect with someone who wasn't there. Like in the kitchen, massaging his tense shoulders as I had done 1,000 times before. Past Bruce would have fought to contain and sighs of relief, while present Bruce had been visibly uncomfortable. It was the little things that seemed to cause so much pain. Finding myself getting worked up in his room, I left it for the sitting room across the hall. My belongings that had accumulated prior to the shooting had been moved there for safekeeping. The last thing Bruce needed an explanation for was why there was women's underwear in his dresser drawer. I decided to change into casual attire given that the remainder of the evening was to be spent indoors and in the confines of Wayne Manor. No doubt it would be some time before I was able to kidnap Bruce away for another outing. After meditating, stretching exercises and a brief catnap on a chaise, I heard a soft rap on the door. If I hadn't been 4 months pregnant, I would have been polite and risen to my feet to answer the door. Instead, I cordially called out, "Who dares disturb my slumber?" Head snuck into the partially ajar door. "It is I, Aladdin." After nodding in approval, I watched him step into the room and walk over to me. Pausing at the head of the chaise, he resumed, "We patched everything up. Bruce seems to be okay with what happened, although Bruce asked me how he made you pregnant, so thanks for that." I smirked before inquiring, "Did you tell him?" Sighed, "No, I think today has been eventful enough, and I think you should tell him." I glared at him. He cleared his throat, "I'll tell him tomorrow, after breakfast." After telling me that Alfred was preparing dinner and that he was heading out the commissioner, I asked, "Where's Bruce?" "Changing. I won't be back up tonight, so if you need a ride home, I'm sure Alfred can." I cut him off as I rose to my feet. "I think I'll just stay here tonight, little sleepy over to make up for today." Before leaving he commented, "You do realize Alfred will make you sleep in separate rooms." I countered with, "Who said anything about sleeping?" Snickered to himself as he stepped into hall. I waited for Bruce outside of his bedroom door, startling him when he opened it. He had traded the suit for jeans and a dark blue fitted polo, the casual look that he had taken to in recent months. To appease him, I smiled warmly and asked, "Care to take a girl to dinner? I hear Chef Alfred has something divine on the menu." Bruce smirked nervously before nodding, "My pleasure." As we walked towards the stairs, I instinctively reached out and took his hand into mine. Rather than recoil, he squeezed my fingers gently. It was the little things that seemed to cause so much joy. We arrived at the dining room to see two places set next to each other with a white candle flickering softly on the table. Rich aromas wafted off of the steaming plates of stuffed manicotti, heightened by tweaks of garlic and Parmigiano Reggiano. I had expected Bruce to be tense through dinner given what he had endured in the last few hours. Instead he was inquisitive about the baby and if that had been why I had been under the weather last month. A detective to his core. "Is it a boy or a girl?" he asked with a spot of arrabbiata sauce on his lip. Drowning the urge to lick it off, I simply pointed it out for him and answered as he wiped it with a napkin, "I don't know, I want it to be a surprise." He smirked before replying, "I like surprises." After dinner, we decided to ignore Alfred's rule of not being in the kitchen without him in order to clean up after ourselves. Given that we were two somewhat capable adults, I had no doubts that we would be able to wash, dry and put dishes away without bringing any ahrm upon Alfred's sanctuary. I barely washed a spoon before things turned ugly. Who knew that the scrub sponge was too rough for the ceramic and that it would scratch it slightly? And it was Bruce who bent the spoon to show how strong he was. And he was the one who started the soap fight. And I was the one who finished it. The end. Now we will see you in the next video.